I'm so sorry. I'm on mountain time and I just was confused.
It's
Raja
all
just
good.
said that and I panicked. I was like, I didn't even think about time zones. You're good though.
We call that East Coast privilege.
Right.
When you just say a time out loud and you assume everyone is operating on East Coast time, that happens all the time to me. So
I'm so glad that you're all here. Thank you for doing this. Um, Thanks for doing this. Basically, there's no reason except for I just wanted to. I thought I have so many smart friends who are engaged in what's going on in the world and engaged in their different areas of expertise. And I know that I also have a lot of friends who aren't exposed to those kind of conversations that you may be having. And so I just thought it'd be really fun to pull you all together and talk about in these last few days before the election is final, what we think this 2020 is all about and what you think other people should be thinking of. And I think you each have incredible kind of insights to bring to that. So thank you so much for doing it. And so I'm just going to use the outline that I sent. Feel free to follow along. Like I said, please make this conversational. Feel free to just chime in whenever, even if there's a directed question, you can follow up afterwards. Also feel free to ask each other questions and follow up or whatever. So I just hope that it feels a little more conversational. Cool? All right. So I'd like to start with some introductions. You all don't know each other and the listeners may not know you as well. So if you could just start by telling us your name, where you're at right now, how you identify, and just sort of a brief summary of your professional background. Saraja, would you mind starting for us?
No, not at all. Hey y'all, I am Saraja Rahim and I have a master's of public health. And this summer during COVID, I started a tiny consultancy called Groundsheet, and it is about organizational accountability to social justice and to racial justice and racial equity, helping organizations that are internally driven to like do the work to make themselves better, to make the world better, helping them connect these issues to their mission. And so expanding their mission, developing their mission, growing their mission, and then creating some really clear action steps to some ultimate goals. I live in Atlanta-ish, Georgia. I live in Decatur, Georgia, which is also where I grew up. I moved back here this summer from Philadelphia to be closer to my family and so that my husband and I could have some family around my 1-year-old daughter, Marula. And I'm excited to be here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm 5'3". I feel like now it's just turning into a dating profile. So that's all I have.
You like long walks on the beach.
Long walks on the beach.
Thanks, Saraja. Brandon, go ahead.
yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for getting the group together today. I'm really excited for our conversation. For the listeners, my name is Brandon Wolf. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently in Orlando. I have lived in Florida for the last, gosh, I think almost 12 years now, but I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. And in truth, I'm fairly new to this work of advocacy and activism. I've really only been doing the work for about the last 4.5 or so years. I was inspired and motivated to start sharing my story in the wake of the shooting at Pulse nightclub in 2016. I was at the club with my best friends Drew and Juan that night, and everything about it was ordinary. It was the place that we'd carved out in our community to be ourselves, to hold hands with someone we liked without looking over our shoulders, to wear whatever we wanted without being worried that someone would toss a homophobic slur our way. It was the place that we would call safe in the LGBTQ community. And I think it was that for a lot of people. And then, of course, as is well documented, someone stole that from us just after 2 o'clock in the morning. I was washing my hands at a bathroom sink, and a man charged in the front door, filled with hatred, armed with a weapon of war, and fired 110 rounds into the club. After about 3 hours of a standoff with police and a hostage situation, he'd killed 49, mostly LGBTQ people of color, including my best friends. And for me, that was the spark that lit the things I was already passionate about. I understood in that brief moment in time that my story wasn't insignificant, that my lived experience wasn't just a drop in the ocean, but rather our collective stories, our collective lived experiences are the things that make us powerful as a society. And so I wanted to ensure that my best friends didn't just end up 2 of 49 gun violence victims in America, but rather that their stories lived on and hopefully serve to inspire other people. So in the summer of 2016, I launched an organization called the Drew Project in honor of my best friend. And since then, we have created safe spaces for LGBT young people in schools. We've given away just over $75,000 in college scholarships. I've also taken an active role in the gun violence prevention movement, advocating for organizations like Everytown and Giffords. I testified before the House Ways and Means Committee on behalf of Giffords last October. And for the last year and a half, I have served as the statewide media relations manager for Equality Florida, which is our state's largest LGBT civil rights organization. So from just a little old barista at Starbucks to the world I'm living right now, it feels incredibly humbling, and it's an incredible honor to be able to do this work. And I'm really excited for the conversation today.
Yeah, thanks. I remember Barista Brandon, and it's fun to watch how your career has taken off and your passions. And of course, we talked about that on an earlier episode when we were talking about the Pulse shooting. And so thanks for coming back to the pod. You're the first repeat guest.
I love that, a twofer.
Brandon, how would you say that you identify? What identities resonate for you?
Yeah, thanks. Apologies for missing that part. I am a queer man. I am a queer man of color. I am Black and white. I also identify as having come from a majority white community. And so all of those things, I think, shape my lived experience today.
Yeah. Thanks, Brandon. Alberto.
Yeah, super excited to have this conversation today. I'm Alberto, y'all. I know most of you, but it's so good to meet you, Brandon, and I'm so impressed by the work you're doing. I live in Florida too. I live in Miami, Florida, so South Florida. Lots of heat, lots of humidity. I'm Cuban American. I was born and raised on the island of Cuba, and at an early age, we kind of migrated here. And at some point in my, like when I think about that identity as Cuban American, like I was always like, I'm Cuban, I'm Cuban, I'm Cuban. And then it gets to a point you're like, oh crap, I've been in the US a lot longer than I spent in Cuba. And then I'm like, oh, I am American. Oh, so that conversation has been like sinking in for the past 10 years. The most exciting moment for me in the past decade was 2012, which is the first time I actually voted in an election. And that kind of engagement, even though it seems maybe seemingly like small, defined and changed a lot of like the sense of duty for others, the sense of having conversations, and that's why I'm here. Like I thought when we talked about coming together and having this conversation, I was like, of course we must have this conversation. I am a proud fur doggy daddy. I got 2 German Shepherds. I am married to Carlos, which you'll probably hear about later on. I am gay. I said I was Cuban. I identify as Latinx, Hispanic, and Alberto with he, his pronouns. So we're here. We're queer. We're going to stay. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alberto. Naz?
Oh, Alberto, you crack me up. Yes, so greetings, Zanazun. It's a good day in Danaka, which is Koyukon Athabascan, which is part of my heritage. I'm Athabascan from Alaska and Lumbee from North Carolina, which, are indigenous communities. So that's my main, the main way I identify. She, her. I am currently in New Mexico, which is great because for the last couple of years I've been in Michigan, and the Midwest was just like, it wasn't for me, y'all. What has been really great about moving into 2020 is the fact that I have been able to really lean into what I feel is like my true self, right? I think I've been holding back my real opinions about what it means to be a woman of color in these lands that are so-called America. And so it's just been kind of like a blessing, but a real hard one. And in that way, you know, I'm honored. I'm able to do a bunch of really great work. I am a reformed chemist. I am currently an attorney. I work for Tribal Cultural Resources Advocate at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law currently. So, you know, I'm just like fantastically amazed at this group of people. Saraja, what's up, girl? Brandon, pleasure to meet you. I love your work you're doing. And Nate, heart you for bringing us together.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you're all here. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Nate. I use he, him pronouns. I identify as queer. I identify as a white man and spiritual. And I think that all of those things interconnect for me in ways that are challenging and also privileged. And I think sort of reckoning with that balance has been something that I think I've tried to do for a long time, but especially right now, which we'll talk about as we kind of think about this moment that we're in. And Naz, I'll start with you this time. The first question I'd love to just sort of get out the gate from all of you is, what issues are on the top of your mind right now as we move into this 2020 election? It feels like it's been building for 10 years, but here we are almost up until election day. And I wonder what's most pressing on your mind at this point as we head into that election.
Well, you know, I think I would be like super remiss if I didn't like lead with like COVID-19 and the disparate impact it's had on Indigenous communities. I mean, you know, Navajo Nation has had one of the highest per capita infection rates, and, you know, it's exacerbated, right, by these historical disparities. So even though we are all, you know, living on Indigenous, you know, unceded Indigenous lands here in the United States, like we just don't have the reciprocity has not been, you know, honest and equitable with Indigenous communities. The Navajo Nation, you know, it's a sprawling reservation, which I loathe that term just in general, just because of the minimizing of genocidal history that it does. But that aside, you know, there's just no infrastructure, right? There's no running water. So if COVID-19 is like, wash your hands, you can't even, you have to, you know, go and haul water still yet, you know, and it is the same in my home communities in Alaska as well. You know, my dad lives on an allotment in the interior of Alaska, and there is no running water, and there's he, you know, uses a generator, right? So there's just a very real situation that's occurring in America, and you know, I get irritated sometimes when people, you know, start talking about, oh, you know, we got to worry about third world countries. I was like, pause for the cause. Let's honor our Indigenous communities and really understand what it is that we need to be able to take care of ourselves, right? And just honor, you know, tribal sovereignty and provide the things that were, you know, promised in exchange for living here. And so those, I think that's my number one, but I have several, so.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll dig into more of those. Alberto, what would you say? What's at the top of your mind for the election right now?
There's so many things, right? Like constantly worried, constantly stressing. I'm like, oh my God, like I gotta take care of my mental health. Like, because you're thinking of all the things. I think healthcare is one that really, really concerns me, particularly the proximity to that court case that's ongoing right now, and the ongoing nomination and probably confirmation of a new justice. That really worries me, not just for me and my family, directly like my husband and me, but also because of my very immediate family members. My parents, both my parents are working class. My mom works in housekeeping at a hospital, at an airport. My dad works in facilities at a hospital. And so their access to healthcare, my sister is just became a mom for the second time. And she has the most beautiful, Jayla is her name. And I actually got a picture here, which I gotta show you. If you're listening, you can't see, just imagine the two most beautiful babies. This is Jayla and Kaylee. And, you know, the way that she's able to access healthcare, particularly for my niece, Kaylee, who was diagnosed with sickle cell. I like that is one of the most primary areas that I'm like, oh, we need to do right by our communities. And I can't dive too deep emotionally about how much that concerns me. That's just one spoke of the wheel. I think, you know, LGBTQ rights, and, you know, we talk about gay marriage and we'll talk about that later. And that kind of centers the gay identity, you know, it kind of centralizes and puts it at the very center. But we have to talk about what it means for the other letters in LGBTQ, right? Particularly trans folks of color, in the deterioration of access to healthcare and rights. And those are some of the areas I'm like, gosh, like this is such a monumental moment on November 3rd. So yeah, definitely thinking about a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Alberto. Brandon, what's on your mind?
You know, I appreciate what's been said already. And I think for me, it's the umbrella that's over all of those, and that is the health of our institutions as a whole. I'm really worried about what 4 more years looks like of Donald Trump. I'm really worried about what that means for our healthcare system. I'm also worried about what that means for our election system. I'm really worried about what that means for our criminal injustice system. I'm really worried about what that means for our judicial system. You know, Amy Coney Barrett is just one justice who's been nominated and will likely be confirmed, unfortunately. But Donald Trump has been packing federal courts from the day he set foot in office, with the goal of, you know, helping to enrich him and his family and his friends and the wealthy cohort of people that have surrounded themselves by the Trumps. And I worry mostly about what those institutions failing would mean for the most marginalized people in the country, right? Whether that's Indigenous people, whether that's LGBTQ people, whether that's women, whether that's communities of color, whether that's immigrant communities. We watch what happens when these institutions fail, and it's those communities that struggle first. It's those communities that suffer first. When our immigration system is under attack, who suffers first? Women and children at the border who are in cages, who are being denied healthcare access, who are being denied blankets and toothpaste, right? They're the ones who suffer. You know, who suffers when our criminal injustice system breaks down, and when the president of the United States takes a blowtorch to that system? Who suffers? It's communities of color across the country. So in my mind is the health of our infrastructure as a whole, the health of our governing system, and the idea that if we give Donald Trump 4 more years in the White House, we may not have those institutions and those structures in the same way that we have them today.
Saraja, what would you add to all that? What's left?
I feel like you all covered a lot of the things that I would cover. And so I think I would say my kind of top issue around what's at stake is sort of the ease at which we can approach a lot of these things. I feel like a thing that I've been really thinking about over the summer is kind of the enormous numbers of people that we've seen turn out and protest on behalf of Black folks in this country who are experiencing disproportionate police violence and state violence and systemic violence, but then also on behalf of themselves, because what we know is that if someone's experiencing something disproportionately, it's very likely that everyone is experiencing a very similar thing, but the surrounding context is trying to racialize that thing so that it can then ignore it. So like white supremacy culture racializes things that it can then deprioritize. I think that we definitely see that with COVID. So COVID, I think, has been heavily racialized as Black, and I think it's been heavily racialized as Indigenous, and I think it's made it a lot easier for people as a population to be like, well, this isn't a big deal, because the people who are getting it are people who don't have value within our society. And so I think that when I think about kind of what's at stake, I think about the ease with which we're building like an intersectional movement for like class solidarity. Like as we're thinking about how do we protect the environment, I think that looks different from community to community, but our ultimate goals as people who are not rich people are the same in a lot of ways. I think everybody wants to have jobs, but everybody wants to have the earth exist and be habitable and beautiful for children 7 generations from now. I think that Indigenous 7 generations thinking is really important. And I think that all of us kind of working together to really think about, how do we make sure that people have the healthcare that they need on a regular basis? How do we make sure that we're protecting the environment? How do we dismantle these systems of oppression really deliberately that were created and kind of rest on anti-Blackness, but are impacting all of us and literally killing all of us? And how do we really dismantle the fracturing of working class folks that we've let happen over centuries of the United States existence?
Yeah, thanks. I want to dig into some of those topics a little bit more that each of you brought up. And so starting with what Suraja was speaking to at the beginning, it feels like we are definitely in some sort of moment right now. I mean, 2020 is a whole bunch of moments and a whole bunch of craziness and insanity going on in different aspects of our lives, from the pandemic to politics. Sorry, I just got a Zoom pop-up notification about the 40-minute limit coming up. So stay tuned. I'll restart that. You know, part of what it feels like is happening right now in sort of society as a whole within the United States is many people are sort of having a racial reckoning that they haven't before. And of course, that's happening alongside other people who've been awake to this and doing racial justice work for decades. And I wonder, you know, for this conversation, I'd like to hear each of you kind of speak to what you feel like this moment is around race. And part of what's causing me to ask that question is, I know from my own work, you know, like professionally and on my staff where I work, and just like on social media, it seems like it's very easy for this to become something that's centering the wrong voices. And so what I mean by that is a lot of this reckoning or whatever this moment is right now is really about white people learning not to be racist. And then that kind of dominates the conversation instead of the actual injustices and oppression that need to be at the center of that conversation. And so I'm wondering, I guess first what I'd like to hear, and again for each of you, what are you feeling in this moment about racial justice personally? What do you feel like is at stake in this election, particularly for Black and Indigenous and Latinx and other marginalized communities? Just sort of starting that conversation on how we're unpacking this racial justice movement that in some ways is about learning and waking up to injustices around us, but in other ways can sometimes feel like lip service, because we're also not seeing a lot of accountability. We're still not seeing justice for Breonna Taylor. We're not seeing accountability in a lot of police environments. And so I'm wondering, how does all that kind of show up for you in this moment? And Suraja, if you don't mind speaking to this first.
I think that part of what we're seeing is kind of a deliberate conceptualization of like activism and change in the United States, which I think gets really heavily focused on individuals and individual actions, which I think is a part of white culture. And I think that that's a big part of, honestly, like white supremacist culture, is like the emphasis on like individuals working alone, when I think that the actual thing that we need to do is like our collective work, and then like our collective action. What does that look like? And then how does that impact all of us? And so if we all get hyper focused on whether or not we put the black box up, or whether or not we said the right thing to apologize, and I think that we really can lose the actual actions that we need to take to like make the world better. And I think it makes us not be as brave, because then it doesn't challenge people's current level of comfort. You hear people say like Black Lives Matter, but then when people are like defund the police, people are like, whoa, that's too far, that's too far. Because I think that they imagine that their life is going to change, and it will. Unless you live in the suburbs, and then it won't, because what everybody is asking for is just like, Black people want to be policed like white people in the suburbs get policed. Not like Black people have been pushed into the suburbs by gentrification get policed, but people want to have their basic needs met. People want to live in a community where everyone's having their needs met, because those communities are safer and the police don't hang around them. Regular behaviors that are just poverty aren't criminalized. And so if we're working collectively and thinking collectively, we're thinking, how do these issues, these broader issues, impact people, and then how do we fix or dismantle those issues? And then also like a willingness to maybe fundamentally change how we are operating, and then in some ways just fundamentally expand the benefits or the conditions that white folks have to everyone, including poor white folks. I think that's another thing, is that people, when you get kind of focused on the individuals, you can lose the people who are being marginalized, because again, focus on the individual means that you don't notice that this is happening to another community.
Yeah.
I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, thanks. I want to ask you to just kind of follow up to that a little bit, because I think with the defund the police movement in particular, a lot of people who are not familiar with what that would look like, that feels scary to them. Like, how can a society exist without policing? And I appreciate that explicit comparison to the suburbs, and sort of this is a model that already exists. And so I wonder if you could elaborate just a little bit more on what defund the police means to you, and the practicality of us actually moving towards something like that.
Sure. So right now, the police are really over-relied upon. They're relied upon to provide social services across the board for almost everything. In fact, like, to get emergency services, even if you don't want the police, like, you're immediately directed to the police. You're directing people who aren't trained to deal with certain situations to those situations. And of course, that's going to cause conflict. Pretending that the police are prevention for crime, they're not. Like, of course, it's going to cause conflict. What defund the police means is taking funds that are used to fund policing to things that we hope that policing does, but that it's not trained to do, and actually just giving the money to the experts. There are people who are trained to prevent violence. It's not the police. The police are trained to respond to stuff. And then there are people who are trained to respond to mental health concerns. It's not the police. There are people who are trained to, I think, respond to conflicts in schools. Like, again, like, that's not the police. So directing funds to those folks so that they can do their jobs and do their work better instead of having to like write grants, is honestly just, it's sensible first and foremost, but also it saves money. We lose a lot of money paying for weird weapons for the police to carry around. We lose a lot of money training them to police more brutally, like getting policing tips from countries nobody should get policing tips from. I think that there are functions that police forces can have within society, like investigating crimes that have already been committed. And honestly, that happens so infrequently for Black communities and for the hundreds of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I think that a lot of people are already experiencing what happens when you only have the police in your community taking your money with silly fines, and harming folks. Like, a lot of people are already experiencing communities where the police aren't helping.
Yeah. Brandon, what are you feeling in this moment of this kind of national conversation on race? And what do you think is at stake in this election for communities who've been sort of marginalized in society?
Yeah, appreciate it. And thank you, Saraja, for really, I think, distilling what I'm feeling in my community, and certainly what I think I'm seeing around the country, which is an inflection point. There is a lot of pain in the American story. There's a lot of hurt and harm and violence and death. It is what this country is built upon. And I think for a really long time, there are communities, and I mean namely white communities, who've been able to hide from that they've been able to, you know, put the black box on Instagram or whatever is the current fad without actually having to address or digest the pain that other people are feeling. And so what you're seeing in this moment, especially in, you know, communities that are protesting and having their voices heard, is that pain bubbling to the surface. I really appreciate the conversation about defunding the police, because the approach that I've taken with folks in my community is to ask, what do you hope the police are accomplishing? What do you hope they're achieving with their work, right? And specifically, I'm asking, you know, white folks who may be a little bit nervous about having a conversation about defunding the police. And inevitably, the conversation always comes back to, well, I expect the police to help make my community safer, right? And so then my next question is, well, how do we measure that? What are you using as your sort of barometer of success, right? And that inevitably leads us to lower crime rates. And so then we get into the conversation about, so how do you know that where the mayor and the city commissioners are investing your money is actually helping to deliver that in the most efficient way possible? How do you know that? Do they provide you, you know, a report of the results? Do they share with you why the police having 30% of the city's budget is actually helping them to accomplish that goal better than directing those funds anywhere else would? Have you considered that when the police force is using 30% of a city's budget, but affordable housing is only 0.2% of that city's budget, have you considered how that might actually help to make crime in your community worse? Have you considered that investing in, you know, curbing poverty, making sure people have food to eat, they have a roof over their head, they have access to the resources that they need? Have you considered that investing in those things might actually help you achieve the safe community that you're looking for? And I found that people are really willing to have that conversation. They may get stuck on what it's called because that's the structure and the system that we work within. As soon as somebody said defund the police, you know, the structure and the system that we're in immediately went into overdrive, trying to demonize that and characterize that. But I think when we break down to the central tenets of what we're talking about, there is agreement. And that's only come through this inflection moment in American history. I hope that it continues to be reflection and inflection. I know, you know, from a personal space, I've learned a lot about myself and my own journey. I've learned a lot about how insidious white supremacy has been in my own lived experience. I mentioned in the beginning that I identify as someone who grew up in a majority white community. I've learned a lot in the last 6 months about what that has meant for who I am today. This idea that I have to be exceptional in order to assimilate. This idea that, you know, if the white kid over there was getting B's, I had to get A's. If he was doing 5 extracurricular activities, I had to do 7. That if I wore my pants just 2 inches lower, that I would be considered a criminal and not allowed to fit in. I've learned a lot in the last 6 months about the structures of white supremacy and how that has infiltrated the way that I live my life. My hope is that we allow this moment to be painful, that we allow this moment to be a true and honest inflection point for America, and that we understand, to get to the last part of your question about what's at stake, we understand that what's at stake today is what's always been at stake for marginalized communities. That a single election, that Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, does not define what has been inflicted upon communities in this country for centuries, but rather it is a moment for us to recognize what's always been happening, to recognize what will continue to happen if we do not stop it, and then to take action right here, right now. I thought AOC put it really well earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, when asked if Joe Biden's opinion on fracking was a deal breaker for her. And she said, honestly, no, because this election for me is not about finding the person who's going to solve all my problems. It's about identifying the person that I want to cross from me at the negotiating table, so that come January 2021, when I'm lobbying and I'm protesting and I'm ensuring my voice is heard, that there's someone who is actually receptive to welcoming that voice to the table. That's the moment right now that we're at. That's what's at stake. we're selecting somebody that we will be lobbying and protesting and negotiating with come January of 2021. And if I break that down to who I'd rather be doing that with, for me, the choice is very clear.
Yeah, yeah. And as serious and important as all those things are, I have to admit that whenever I hear fracking, the first thing I think of is the video of Bob the Drag Queen and Peppermint from RuPaul's Drag Race.
The fracking?
Fracking. So I'm going to add in a little audio clip there so that people hear
Great.
it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Naz, what about you? What are you feeling in this moment?
Oh, Nate. I mean, I think I'm very weary, right? And so, you know, people are doing a real terrible job of uplifting other people's voices, right? We are definitely, I saw an ad the other day where I believe it's the woman who wrote White Fragility. But she got like $30,000 to do like a day seminar at Harvard. I mean, so that's right. I'm annoyed by really, white women occupying spaces that they need to step away from and uplift other voices to be heard that are speaking in authentic spaces. And so that, but also to Suraj's point about the individualistic nature of this Western society, it's a hugely problematic, right? So we can't care about one another genuinely, right? Because we need to be worried about getting our little house with the picket fence, right? And our individual homes and we're not caring about our collective community anymore, right? So I've been harping on this issue of breaking down these silos of separation that are really, I think, hampering us from reaching our true human potential, which is just to care about community. And I think, our small group here that we have can absolutely see the benefit of all of us joining together and raising our voices and lifting one another up, right? And so one of the things that I've been really enjoying is, this like the whole BIPOC movement, right? I think Indigenous and Black and people of color and immigrants and just I love this idea of our collective unity coming together, right? I think that can be really powerful if we move through the world in the right way and keep that momentum up and these connections going. Also, I think that there's a lot of room for growth, right? And so I've been trying to just speak to close friends and family about doing some of this work and then letting go of the people that I feel like I cannot have in my life that I can't do that work for, right? I have shared, right, reading lists, like, here, read this book, because people do come and ask me, right? And they might be friends of friends or remote family, right? And so there's so much work. I'm definitely weary, but I'm also hopeful, right? I think that we're primed to make a big difference. And if, Germany can teach their society that the heinous, history that they went through and teach that was shameful. I met a young girl actually in the far north of Norway who was sharing, she's like, we're taught to be ashamed. She was from Germany. She's like, we are taught to be ashamed of that part of our history. And she had to have, a real like tough conversation with her grandmother and ask her grandmother, well, grandma, you lived through this. What was your role in this, right? So we're at that place where we need to have these tough conversations, and we need to have that reckoning, and we need to re-envision, where we're going, right? And yeah, some of these statues, they shouldn't be up, right? Take them down. You can put them in a museum and talk about why they were up in the first place, but let's move on, right?
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful, but I'm tired.
Fair. Put that on a t-shirt. Hopeful but tired. I want to follow up with that real quick, and then Alberto will come to you. I'm wondering, because even for myself, I'm trying to be very intentional about how I am positioned in this conversation and what space I take up and what I don't. And to your point about lifting up other people's voices, I mean, that's part of the reason why I've pulled you all together, is because I love each of your voices and I want to lift those up. But I'll also share, for me, you know, I've been fortunate to have a lot of formal education and training about social justice issues in my grad program and professional development opportunities and conferences, you know, throughout my career, to be exposed to different conversations about privilege, identity. And of course, that's been my own journey, because that's not something that I ever considered myself, you know, privileged growing up, because we were poor, I was closeted and gay, I lost a lot of family and friends when I came out. And so there were many things that caused me to think I could never be privileged, right? Which of course is, you know, not true. And so in interrogating my own whiteness, you know, in addition to that, sort of throughout my career doing it, I will say that in the last several months, it's been at a heightened level for me, because there's been a new importance and urgency. And also I had to recognize that there was still a lot more work for me to do, because I think it was really easy for me to think, oh yeah, I learned about this in grad school, check. But I wasn't really doing the work on a daily basis to think about how it influences me as a person, as a supervisor, as a manager, as a friend, as someone who works in trauma response. And, you know, what's the intersection of trauma and identity, and how does that influence a survivor's experience with violence and their access to resources? And so I've really been trying to engage with this in a different, more intentional way in the last several months. But I've also been mostly keeping that private. And I'm not sure exactly why. I think part of it has been my fear of it feeling or sounding performative, or centering myself and my own learning in that process. And so I wonder, Naz, and then anyone else who wants to jump in, what would you say to white folks like me who want to be good allies to Black and Indigenous and other people of color, and want to do this work, but also don't want to tokenize their friends or make them responsible for educating them or giving them reading lists? What would you say to folks like me who want to go about this in an intentional way, but perhaps are not exactly sure of the best path to do that?
Well, so, you know, well, there's several ways, right, within which you can do that work that isn't gonna, you know, be placing the burden on your, you know, your community. So you're having this conversation with a group of, you know, your friends, right now, right here and right now, and that's fine, because we're lifting up, right? And you're going to share this conversation, and hopefully other people can listen and benefit from it. But, you know, Nate, don't, you know, think that it's not valuable to have the conversation with, you know, your community, right? Your white managerial community. You guys can have that conversation and do that work, right? There's so many resources out there to lead and guide, to do, you know, the work. And so I implore, I beg of everyone to just, you know, have that conversation, you know, don't burden us with the requests of what to do. The resources are out there. Seek and ye shall find, Nate.
Yeah. And on this website, on the Second Way website, I have a list of a lot of resources and readings that I found helpful. And if any of you want to share additional ones, I'll add those too after this episode. Would anyone else like to respond to that in general, what you would want to say to white folks in this moment? You don't have to.
I personally, I think it's important to have these conversations with. I mean, for me personally, have these conversations with people in your life, not just white, but people who occupy positions of privilege in general. And for me, it's making sure I communicate the message that my bar is really low for them to ask questions. Because if I actually want them to move in a direction that's helpful for all, I have to be open for some of those statements or questions that are like, maybe like 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been okay with you asking that. But if you're asking with good intention and it's actually with the aim and goal to better yourself or be a better ally, yeah, I'm here. Like, let's talk.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And Alberto, just stay with you to answer that initial question. How are you feeling in this moment? What do you feel like is at stake related to race and this sort of national conversation right now?
I blame the patriarchy. I'm just kidding. When in doubt, blame colonialism. But honestly, I do want to stay there for a moment. For me and my community as a Cuban American, having conversations with my peers who, when we talk about white communities, and I oftentimes think of the Cuban American community in South Florida, I think that they have situated themselves in many ways, and I don't want to speak for them, but in many ways kind of in a privileged position in comparison to other immigrant groups, and don't see themselves as part of the equation. When CNN or MSNBC or whoever says, immigrant populations, Cubans are like, yeah, that's not us. Like, I don't know, at least in my immediate friends and family, that is not how the identity carries through. And so I try to think about the origin of things. Like, where do things come from? Like, where do they begin and why do we believe that? And then as I was, preparing for this conversation, I thought about generational trauma and how people kind of internalize things that their ancestors went through or their parents, right? And so in the case for Cuban Americans, there's the Cuban Revolution, right, from 1959, where, really highly educated and, well-to-do folks came to the US. And so the US is a beacon of hope. And so there is a clash of conversation when they're hearing in the news that this country's done a terrible job, because they're like, actually, no, it hasn't. It helped us, right? So there's that particle of it. And then the other one is me actually shining a light on, well, the revolution was in 1959. So a lot of us in my generational line, like my cousins and others, we didn't see that. We didn't experience it. And yet we talk about it and we're angry about it. So is it reasonable, and this is a statement I make to my fellow family and friends, is it reasonable that Black folks in the US would be angry about things that went on for a lot longer with their ancestors? Is it reasonable for us to think of their generational trauma similar, even though it's not the same, and I want to say that, but in the same way that we feel angry about the revolution, even though we weren't there, we didn't see it, right? In the same way that maybe my family and friends in the Cuban community say, get over slavery already, which is a statement that's made, right? Or get over the conversation around racial injustice. And I say, get over the revolution. And how does it feel when I say that? And that's been, for me, that's because I left Facebook, I left a lot of forms of social media because it was a lot, right? Like, all happening at once. And that's a privilege for me to be able to check out and say, oh, but within the scope of my influence, those were the conversation I was having. Let's talk about this. Try to step into someone's shoes for a moment and see it in this way. And so, yeah, that's where I'm at in this moment. And I do think in the context of the election, to come back to that, I think, in a year when everything came together, I do think there is a correlation between the frustration of many other things coming together and people standing together in places. Sorry, I saw the word cheese stick and I lost track of what I was saying. People coming together to protest this issue, right? And I thought about, Siraja, to come back to a comment you made earlier about the way that we choose to protest or do activism being kind of white approach, I watched this episode of Insecure, and there was a moment where the two main characters are standing at a concert, and they had a huge conflict between the two of them, and they solved their issue by just dancing and looking at one another. And literally, like, this is my interpretation. If you watch it, you may have a different one, but there is a long scene where they're just literally just jamming. And they look at each other, and they've been fighting, and then there's like a smirk, and then there's like, and I think about how many of us haven't thought about conflict resolution by actually being present in a place together in a community kind of way, not by like, let's sit down and write down a new proclamation of whatever, but actually just being somewhere with someone and actually being there for them, like as a body, as someone to lean on, like literally lean on. I don't mean like, let me write this for you, And so even conceptualizing ways to support our friends and our communities through other ways that maybe we haven't thought about in a while. And the last thing I'll say here is I discovered that I have avocados, mangoes, and pineapples in my backyard. This, I mean, that is sort of like what? Like, okay. That happened. And immediately my mango trees, I have two of them, they filled up with mangoes. Like this was as COVID began, right? And so I was like, what am I gonna do with all these mangoes? Like there's no way. And after 1 week, I was like, I can't have another mango, like, right? And so someone said, you should start selling them. Like this is what the thing you should do. And then I was like, that's a lot of work. And I'm gonna be real, like I didn't move into this direction right away, but I did eventually. And it was creating a community-based connection with the fruit. Like going to neighbors and going, hi, I live down the block and I just wanted to bring you some mangoes from my tree. And hey, I live down the block and I know you don't know me, and here's some avocados, right? The pineapples, I ate all of them. So I didn't do the same thing. But with mangoes, it was maybe, you know, sending mangoes to friends, you know, across the country who could have enjoyed, you know, a smoothie or whatever, right? And so just figuring out what are other ways that you can be there for your friends other than what we know as,
Yeah.
The first mangoes my daughter ever ate were mangoes that Alberto sent. So.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
right. I forgot about
love
that.
that.
Oh.
And I'm also very jealous because I did not receive any mangoes. So
Right.
We are-
After this episode, we're all getting mangoes, right?
we love that.
My
Please.
son.
You
Next
get a
season,
mango and
definitely.
you get a mango.
Yes. Saraja, thinking about your public health background, I want to talk about obviously the major global crisis, and particularly for us in this election time, is the pandemic. The Washington Post actually just reported this week that we're at a new all-time high since the beginning of the pandemic. The number of coronavirus cases are still rising. They're at the highest point ever. And hospitalizations are rising in most states, in 38 states. Yet the handling of the pandemic and simple safety measures like wearing a mask, those sorts of things are still very politicized and divisive. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to this a little bit and tell us, in what ways do you think this pandemic situation influences the election, and what should we as voters be thinking about related to this public health crisis?
First, I want to quote the famous TikTok, "The pandemic isn't over just because you're over it." I think that the pandemic has been a tremendous impact on this election. I think that it is a big part of why Donald Trump is so far behind in the polls. Because I think that things that people found tolerable before, injustices that people found tolerable before, because they had the distraction of like their regular everyday life, aren't tolerable in this climate, because people are like, oh man, that looks a lot more blatant when I've been trapped at home for 3 months. I think it's been a lot clearer to people that the harm that's being inflicted is really deliberate, and it's maximum damage all the time. Like, how do we make this life as terrible, as sad for everyone? And I think people are realizing that the only thing that was even cushioning them a little bit was their privilege. But even the most diligent person can erode someone else's privilege and the benefits of that. I think that this kind of collective grief of 2020, I think is largely linked to the turnout for Black Lives Matter protests and for this kind of racial reckoning. When I think about COVID, yes, I have a public health background. I just want to be clear, I'm not a public health expert, but I think that my background in public health really helped me realize, like, oh no, like this is the most deliberate thing possible. I grew up like next door to the CDC, and I remember being mostly really trusting of that as a foundation, like sketchy background of most United States institutions. But currently, like, I knew a lot of people whose parents worked there. It was a place that I was like, and then one day when I'm really good at public health, I'll go work at the CDC. But seeing how untrustworthy the CDC has been throughout the throughout coronavirus just made me realize like how many federal appointees run these government agencies. I did not realize like how much sway the Trump administration had for these kind of unshakable American institutions, the CDC, the EPA, NOAA, like the OVW, like all of these American offices that we hope are going to be having the public's best interests at heart don't under the Trump administration. And they aren't even trying because they're not even experts in their fields. It's a chronic hiring of people who probably weren't that great in their previous field unless their field was trying to funnel money. And now they're being tasked with things that they have absolutely no capabilities to understand or do. But that's the point. Like, they are only there to corrupt. They are not there to help. They are not there to do well in those positions. I think the thing that really tipped me off is like when the kind of mask mandate came around initially, it was like, nobody needs a mask. And I was like, okay, I believe it because the CDC said it. Why wouldn't I? But as I started to go along, I was like, this doesn't make sense. Everyone else is wearing masks in all the other countries. And I started to do research. Like I read probably 20 or 30 papers. I was reading from people who are working abroad and then papers that were conducted here previously, like research that was conducted here. And I was like, there's literally no reason for this specification. Like the mask run already happened. Like this recommendation is erroneous, like it's false and people are going to get hurt. And so I started recommending, if you're friends with me on Facebook, you saw me being like, listen, I know that the government is telling you that you don't need a mask, but you do. Like, please start to wear a mask. And then I didn't realize like how far my faith could drop. But in that moment, being just a random human who was begging the people around them to do something that the government had advised that they not do. And then seeing the government make that recommendation a month later was like horrifying. I think also, again, the COVID's impact on communities of color. I think that there's a lot of like victim blaming where people don't consider the constant physical stress that causes these health disparities for people of color, and then makes us more vulnerable to dying from COVID. And then I think just like there's not very good messaging around coronavirus and then prevention. I think folks are getting into a really hopeless, like, gonna get it sometimes, like everybody across race, across class are getting into that kind of mood, which I think is fair if the largest kind of public branding around it is from a president who's like, it's barely a thing, but it's because you got like the rich person treatment. People are dying from COVID because they don't have access to universal health care. Ooh, hashtag wealth care, said Alberto. That is so accurate. So I'm trying not to get mad at folks who are kind of giving up and just doing whatever they want, even though I feel mad, because I know that it's a big public health failing that could have been prevented. Other countries are living their best life. And again, it goes back to that kind of individualism as well. But you need like a central organizing body, and that's what the government's for. And then they're actively working against better state governments who are trying to do best by their populations.
Yeah, I think, conspiracy theories have existed forever, but I think what's been just particularly just unreal to me is the united force around rejecting expertise and science, and like people that we would normally look to and say, okay, you're the person who should be telling us, Dr. Fauci, you should be telling us what to do and we should be listening. But that just kind of immediate discrediting of science in general and expertise, and like Brandon has said in the chat, anti-intellectualism. I think that's very present. And so I wonder if anyone else would want to speak to that, or just sort of the COVID situation in general.
I think, social media is really powerful in the sense that it has been really effective at spreading, anti-intellectualism, to use Brandon's term here, but also misinformation. And it is really evident when you're trying to have a conversation with someone who's used social media as their sole, source of input, if you will, and you're having arguments in two different realms of facts. It's literally exhausting and almost impossible to get anywhere, because at every step of the way, you're trying to not only convince them of, this is science, but trying to dismantle whatever they arrive with. And so that's been really challenging. And then the flip side of that is we've seen Twitter and other entities take steps towards, kind of stopping the misinformation. And then that also makes me question, what is the double-edged sword that, what does that pose, right? When social media can actually step in and go, actually, this is misinformation. And surely, like right now, it's working in the advantage of science and, whatever we want to say. But can that actually be used down the road for other things? And that is my Cuban American, like the whole dictatorship background of being told what to think and what to believe. And, that like my ear perks up when I hear, oh, Twitter banned so-and-so's tweet because of whatever. And yeah, okay, I agree with that particular instance, but then I'm like, but what else can they do with that? And so I think social media has been at the forefront of a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I think it's, I appreciate, Saraja, all of your really important insight, and especially, the idea of placing a lot of faith in our institutions, because they're the mechanism that we as a society have created to help guide us through moments like this. And for me, what's been so terrifying about this COVID-19 crisis, and really sort of everything the Donald Trump administration has done, is that it's textbook classic displays of how you amass power and hold on to it. And the ways that you do that is you fracture the population, you divide everybody up, and then you convince them that there are scarce resources. Regardless of what the issue is, the scarcity model is what keeps people siloed, right? So, your belief that if you, there's only a finite amount of power, and if somebody tells you to wear a mask, that you're going to give away that power forever and it's never coming back to your community. The idea that, if you take a certain approach with COVID-19, to Saraja's point, that you are aligning yourself with a foreign interest, and that, there's only so much power in the world that can be amassed. And so we've got to be nationalists first. There's all these moments throughout the Donald Trump administration where he has perfectly employed the playbook that lots of authoritarian leaders have over human, history, which is to divide people, to separate them, and then to convince them that there are resources they're fighting over with other people to stop them from joining forces, right? What would the world look like if we used a model that said we were all stronger if we worked together toward one common purpose, as opposed to a lot of what folks have been saying today, working class or poor whites versus working class or poor marginalized communities fighting over these scraps of resources, while Scrooge McDuck sits on his heap of gold coins in the White House and looks down over it all. So for me, that's what's been most terrifying about COVID-19, is the embodiment of this fracturing of the population scarcity model in order to amass and retain power.
I think Alberto has summed us up a little bit. He just said in the chat, I'm getting the sense this group is not pro-Trump. Guess I could have clarified our bias ahead of time. Naz, anything you'd want to speak to about COVID?
I mean, I think we've, discussed most of the major points. I will say, though, the anti-maskers that exist, and I know we were going to talk about this a little bit later, about the fact that my sister and I drove across the country, right? So I changed jobs recently, and I initially left my stuff in storage in Michigan, and so I needed to go back and get it. And so I coupled that with a detour to DC to see Melissa, a good friend of ours. And so I was shocked and appalled by rural, yeah, and you too, Nate, by rural America, like the separation, right, between what rural America thinks is patriotism and versus, I think it's a very us versus them mentality, right? It's like rural versus the urban, the urban intellectuals, right? They're, the higher you go in the educational system, the more liberal you become, and like, oh, they're so like woke. But I think what they really think about it is that they think that we're not, like they're really true Americans because they're out working on the land and they're farming, right? Now we can go into all the reasons within which they got said land, right? I mean, that's a whole nother podcast, right? But I think that they look down on city dwellers, right? Because they're not doing this real, proud to be American kind of antiquated attempt to, validate themselves, right? And so there's just, large swaths of rural America that refuses to wear masks. So I had to be like, okay, I can stop at this gas station. No, I cannot drive away, because sometimes you can't tell until you get into the store, right? And it was very clear, right? Clear cut. Just as soon as you get into a place where there's a bunch of Trump signs, there's no masks. So I don't know how we got here to 2020. I mean, I do, but it's sad. It's a sad sight.
Yeah, let's stay on that and go ahead and ask the question that I was going to say later about rural America. I grew up in a small rural conservative town in Oklahoma, and went to grad school in Ohio in a small rural conservative town. Then I moved to Florida, where it was pretty mixed because we know Florida is always a swing state. And so there were a lot of conservative people still in my life, and particularly at the formerly religiously affiliated university that I worked for. And so a lot of conservative alumni who were very involved in my work. And so I think because of that, when I think about living in DC now, DC in many ways is just this wonderful like liberal bubble, especially like within the gay community. There's a strong gay community. There are a lot of gay folks here, LGBTQ folks here. And I see that many of them kind of stay in that bubble and aren't as exposed to what's happening in other areas. And then you get sort of a warped sense of reality. I felt this in the 2016 election. Alberto and Saraja and I used to work together at a nonprofit. And at that time I was traveling to military bases. And so, I was constantly in all these rural conservative Air Force bases where I was exposed to people who were talking about Hillary Clinton and telling me what they think and talking about Trump and what was exciting to them. And so I wasn't super surprised in 2016. I was devastated, but I wasn't super surprised. And I wonder now, as if you could speak a little bit more about, you and your sister just did this kind of road trip across country. What is it that you feel, and just kind of elaborating where you left off, what is it that you feel is a part of that divide between rural America and kind of these more populous cities, and in particular as it relates to Trumpism and that kind of patriotism that you were talking about?
Yeah, so, I think I touched on a couple of the main points, which is, this ideology that to be a true American was to be a farming American, right? And that's got all kinds of weird historical roots that are very Western and colonial and imperialistic. But, that aside, I think that there is just a general like distaste in rural America for city life, right? And I don't think that it has like any foundation. I think it's completely erroneous, and I think this just goes back to like we really do need to change our education systems. We need to really see that the ways within which we are similar rather than different. And like there is so much good work that people do in urban areas, and the ways that we live and the ways that we care about one another. And I think that, rural America would appreciate knowing about the ways within which we show up for one another, right? And that we care and that we do have a sense of community. And, maybe perhaps like these protests down city streets have them feeling a little bit shook about their privilege, right? And what's happening out in the cities that can drastically change their life. And I think a lot of You know, and I'll make this very generalized statement about, you know, white rural America. And this could go for suburbs and lots of other areas as well. But they're terrified, you know. I think that that they see us coming for what's rightfully ours. Do you know what I mean? I think that they're scared. There's this whole land back movement going on within the indigenous community, and people are donating land back to indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are buying land back, you know. But if you really get educated and understand the history of this country, then maybe you should be a little bit nervous, but you also, it doesn't mean that we're trying to like shove everybody out. We just need a little bit of equity at this point. It's 2020, you know, we need some we need some land. You know, I would love to have a farm. Hey, hit me up, you know, donate a farm. Let's make, you know, America brown again.
Yes, gotcha. You know, Brandon, I wonder if you can elaborate on this too. You were telling us that you just got back from Appalachia. And in particular, what I'm thinking about is, because from my own experience and from the conservative folks in my social media feeds and in my family, it's often a moral argument that they're making, which for me is a little baffling because I see the world very differently. But often there's this, you know, for a long time, there's been this belief, this myth that the Republican Party has control over like a faith-based perspective. The Christian Party is the Republican Party, that sort of thing. And yet when I think about, because I grew up Christian, very involved in the church, used to work on church staff for a long time. Parents were ministers when I was young. And I think about the teachings of Christ and I compare that to Trumpism, it doesn't line up for me. When I compare it to many of the kind of things that we've seen over the past 4 years, it doesn't line up for me. And so I wonder, Brandon, anything you want to sort of elaborate from that Appalachian perspective, but also thinking about what's the real moral argument? What do you think is at stake here in this election from a moral perspective?
Yeah, I appreciate that Alberto said those values are on pause because it's very clear that, you know, evangelicals have put all the chips in on Donald Trump, who is all of the things they claim to believe are immoral and of no value in society. So, you know, on the one hand, we can talk about how those values have probably always been up for sale, that it's always been about, you know, less about who is actually the politician and more about who is going to pass some arcane, you know, anti-abortion law or put a Supreme Court justice in that's going to, you know, do these one or two things. And we could also talk, this is probably another podcast, but we could talk forever about the perversion of religious values and faith as a weapon against marginalized communities, right? That's been going on for all of time. And we could have a whole podcast about that. But in terms of what I'm seeing in this election, and, you know, really similar to the 2016 election, Barack Obama talks about this all the time, which is this idea that, you know, the fracturing, the division, the scarcity model is being made worse by the social media ecosystems that we've sort of allowed ourselves to be forced into, right? It's sort of a combination of both algorithms and our willingness to just block or mute anyone we don't agree with because things get hostile on social media, right? So we kind of force ourselves into these silos where the only things we hear are things that affirm our worldviews. And if somebody pops up in the comments that we don't know how they got there, we immediately just block them. Oh my gosh, I'm so in love with Sriracha's child. I'm sorry. Hello for all the listeners you can't see, but this is the most adorable special guest ever. So you asked about my trip to Appalachia. I was in North Carolina for the last week, actually right near the borders of North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. So way out in the woods, 30 minutes to the nearest gas station, you know, kind of sketchy, touch and go cell phone service. There's a lot of Donald Trump out there. There's a lot of Trump 2020 signs. There's a lot of, you know, repent signs. There's a lot of all the things you would sort of assume that are out there. There was a lot of what Naz was talking about with face masks. We went to eat breakfast at this local restaurant people really, you know, highly recommended for us. It was probably 20% of people that were wearing masks. There were probably actually more people open carrying firearms in the restaurant than were actually wearing masks. And I bring us back to the reason that I think that exists. And it's this idea of fracturing the population and teaching people that there are groups out there who are coming for your scarce resources, and you must defend them from those groups. And so we have allowed populations to be caricatured into one thing or another, right? And if you're in rural America, if you're in some of these parts of the country, you see cities as bastions of Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters who are, you know, holding fiery torches and pitchforks and are loading up their cars to come and steal your land, and you have to buy all the guns you can carry to defend yourself. A lot of it is rooted in white supremacy. A lot of it is rooted in systemic racism, and it is fueled and inflamed by people in power who can't hold on to that power if all of us wake up and realize that we're all in the same shitty situation together, and we would be a lot better off if we worked together to solve those problems. That power structure survives on the oxygen that is keeping people fighting each other instead of asking tough questions of the people in charge. And it just perpetuates this cycle. So, you know, I struggle, Nate, you talked about your childhood experience. Mine was very similar. I grew up in a very rural town in Oregon. My family is conservative. You know, I would say my grandparents are likely Trump voters. And there's been a lot of difficulty having conversations about those things. But when I find us in tense moments, I bring us back to our shared values. And that is, what kind of world do you want your grandkids to grow up in? Do you want it to be a world where the earth is habitable? Do you want it to be a world where they have clean water to drink and, you know, good food to eat? Do you want it to be a world where when they go to work, they can make a living wage? They don't have to work 4 jobs to afford their rent? Do you want it to be a world where a college education is accessible to them rather than some pipe dream? Those are values that we share. And when I bring us back to those values, I find I can lower the temperature, even if it's just 2 degrees.
Yeah.
Can I say a little bit about Appalachia, Nate?
Yes, please.
So I went to college in Berea, Kentucky, which is in the Appalachian Mountains. We did a lot of camping and hiking and stuff. And I think that sometimes like Southern voices and like Appalachian voices kind of get lost in these conversations. I think that there's really good substantive intersectional like organizing work that's happening in the South. And so I just wanted to highlight some of those organizations for a second. The Highlander Center has a really long history of organizing in the South. And I think that it's definitely worth like checking them out and checking out some of the work that they're doing. The Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation is also a really great organizing body, and they're based in Alabama. The Highlander Center is based in Tennessee. Song Southerners on New Ground is also a great organizing body. Like, there are lots and lots of folks kind of organizing around these issues in the South. And so as folks were kind of describing the vibe or like the feelings of kind of rural white Americans, I think a lot of those feelings are happening in the city. I think they're just diluted by having so many different voices, just by like having a more condensed population. Because I lived in South Philly, and I feel like if you went just like a mile down the road in South Philly, it got real weird real fast. Definitely people having huge conflicts around Christopher Columbus statues, lots of Trump supporters, ethnic like white violence, like Italian versus Irish, but then against people of color in those communities, where it's like his own little sundown town, and it's just South Philly. And so I think that one of the ways that we kind of get separated is like convincing people like that there's a super strong like country mouse, city mouse thing happening, when a lot of folks have overlapping values in a lot of these spaces. And so I just wanted to highlight folks doing organizing work across race, and then also note that a lot of urban white folks are feeling that kind of same alienation or that same fear of losing what they've gotten really used to, even if it's not that great. even if it's not that great. South Philly had a lot of health problems. Um, a lot of folks were working class folks who were losing manufacturing jobs. Um, we're all like in the same boat. I think not recognizing it is a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are really good points. Thanks, Raja. I want to be mindful and respectful of your time. I know this is taking longer than I said it would, so we'll move through the rest of the outline a little more quickly if that's all right with everyone. Brandon, I'm thinking about what you were just talking about, and there's a lot at stake in this election for queer folks in particular, queer and trans people. And that's obviously important to me because of how I identify, but also it's an area that I do my doctoral research on in my PhD program, is specifically about queer and trans adolescents and their experience in public schools. And I'm thinking about, you know, what you were sharing about your conservative family. I have a similar situation. I have several family members who I'm estranged from because of my identity and because of, you know, religious feelings and that sort of thing. And one thing that I've even considered for this election, I think I've talked myself out of it, but I considered actually writing them letters and sort of thinking about the things that are at stake for LGBTQ folks, but just sort of plugging in my own name to make it personal for them. And to say, like, how would you, do you think, not an abstract community, but do you think Nate should be able to be legally fired just for being who he is? Do you think your son Nate should be able to foster and adopt children? Do you think Nate should be able to donate blood in the middle of a health crisis? Do you think, you know, on and on and on, and there are so many types of issues at stake. And so I wonder, you know, with you being the media manager for Equality Florida, with you being a survivor of the Pulse shooting, of course, which was at an LGBT club, you've become a vocal activist on many issues, including queer rights and gun safety, and sort of the intersection of those two things that happened at Pulse. And I wonder, how do you feel like those two issues in particular may be shaped by the outcome of this election? I'm thinking of gun safety, gun violence as one issue, and just kind of queer rights more broadly as another issue. And I'm just wondering what you would, what comes to mind for you about that?
Well, I appreciate you sharing your lived experience, and I appreciate you sharing your approach with your parents. The truth is that the progress we've made as an LGBTQ community, although not nearly enough progress, and certainly we have left parts of the community behind, namely transgender people of color, but the progress that we have made as a community has been made when we've personalized our struggle, right? I think about just how far we've come in this country between like the 1980s and 1990s and now, and that was largely built on people realizing that LGBTQ people were not some boogeyman in the closet, but rather they were their doctor, they were their neighbor, they were their child, they were their cousin, right? And that helped to personalize the challenges and the struggles that our community was facing. When you ask what's at stake for those things in this election, I want to paint a couple of different pictures. First of all, there could be, in my view, not really any clearer contrast between the candidates than on these two particular issues. The Trump administration, to put it all in perspective, is the administration that's been at war with LGBTQ people from the beginning. They might try to make you believe that's not true. They might try to gaslight you by sending Tiffany Trump to Tampa to drunkenly give a speech in her rainbow shirt, but that doesn't change what they've actually done while they've been in office. This is the administration who fired transgender service members in the US military and banned them from serving their country. This is the administration who argued that LGBTQ couples should be barred from adopting children by certain adoption agencies. This is the administration who's done nothing on the blood ban that you talked about. This is the administration who on June 12th of 2020, 4 years to the day after Pulse nightclub, was in court arguing to remove healthcare protections for LGBTQ people. This is an administration who has been at war with LGBTQ people from day one, specifically transgender people. And then you put that in contrast to Vice President Biden, who has among the most comprehensive LGBTQ plans that we've ever seen by a major ticket. They're talking about passing non-discrimination protections. They're talking about, enshrining some of these rights that we fought so hard for into law. And for me, that's really what's at stake right now. We have an opportunity to take what we've fought so hard for and build upon it. We have an opportunity to not just leave the rights that we fought for to the whims of Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, but actually enshrine them into the law to pass comprehensive policies that will protect LGBTQ people across the country. That's at stake right now. Because if we re-elect Donald Trump, we will not be talking about LGBTQ civil rights. We will be talking about the erosions of the way we live every single day. So I feel like that's a huge contrast on the LGBTQ side. And then the contrast gets even starker on the gun violence prevention side. Remember, Donald Trump, in the wake of the shooting in Parkland, had conversations with the families, had conversations with survivors, and said, you know what? I think I'd really like to take a look at common sense gun safety reform. I'd really like to take a look at background checks. I'd like to take a look at extreme risk protection orders. These are things that I'd like to talk about. What happened? Within 24 hours, representatives from the gun lobby and the National Rifle Association were in the Oval Office whining and dining the president, and he walked out of that room and said, forget it, I'm not doing anything on it. And since then, he has used the Second Amendment to continue to fracture and divide the country. He goes out into his rallies and he spews into the microphone, Joe Biden wants to take your guns away and I want guns on every street corner, because all he does is boil things down into tweet-sized sort of headline clips. So the contrast is really stark on gun violence prevention too. I remember in the wake of the shooting in 2016 that we were told that talking about gun violence prevention, talking about common sense gun safety reform was taboo, that it was too dangerous to talk about in the middle of an election cycle, because if we said the words assault weapon ban out loud, that we could help to elect Donald Trump, that we should just stay quiet long enough for Hillary Clinton to be elected president, and then we might be able to have a conversation about gun violence. It didn't work. We still elected Donald Trump president, and what I find so inspiring right now is that Joe Biden is running on a lot of the things that we weren't allowed to talk about in 2016. Joe Biden has said, I will reinstate a ban on assault weapons and high capacity magazines. He has said, we will absolutely pass universal background checks. We will fund gun violence research in this country for the first time in 22 years. He has presented a plan to do all of those things in an environment where he's running against a candidate who has used the Second Amendment as a weapon. So when we talk about the contrasts in the election, I feel like they don't get any more stark than they do on these issues of queer civil rights and of gun violence prevention. And the truth is, when you boil it all down to what could we win or lose on November 3rd, we win or lose the opportunity to have conversations about this at all. Because if you give Donald Trump 4 more years in office, there will be no conversation about the Equality Act. If you give Donald Trump 4 more years in the White House, there will be no conversation about gun violence prevention law. There will be no conversation about assault weapons bans. Those things will not be talked about. We will be fighting for our institutional lives for the next 4 years and beyond. He will pack the courts to ensure that we almost assuredly never pass these laws. And so for me, everything is at stake on November 3rd as it relates to these 2 issues.
Yeah. Alberto, building off of what Brandon was just saying, of course, there are many, many issues at stake for LGBTQ folks, including employment protections, fair housing practices, access to healthcare and inclusive medical services, access to homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, the rights to foster and adopt children. All these sorts of things are on the ballot. But I have to admit to you that I had pretty much gotten to a point where I had taken for granted the fact that at least marriage equality was off the table. You know, it was a long time coming. And in 2015, the Supreme Court made that the law of the land. I remember, as we all do, I'm sure, what that felt like, and also leading up to it when state by state folks were doing that and the excitement and momentum was building. And it's a little deflating right now to realize that the Supreme Court is about to have a sixth conservative justice, and two of the sitting conservative justices have recently signaled that they'd like to reverse that decision, reverse the decision on the ruling that made marriage equality the law of the land. And so I know how that's kind of messing with me and the way I'm thinking about that, but I wonder for you, as a person who is married to your wonderful partner, Carlos, what's coming up for you as you're processing what's going on related to even the issue of marriage in the Supreme Court right now?
Yeah, I mean, aside from actively seeking therapy around this issue, no, but seriously, those are my nightmares. And I don't mean that in a like, oh, this is a nightmare. Like, I literally do have nightmares about that. My spouse and I have been together. We met in 2014. We got married in 2015, right as this was passed. And we had a wedding, like a celebratory wedding, if you will, in 2017, in January 2017, mostly because we were trying to save money to do other things. But I just want to talk about the concept of marriage and union as a performance of community for a moment, like what it represents, what it does, the accountability around it. And for many years, I personally thought, what does it matter to people are together living and not married? Like, it doesn't matter. That's what they choose to do, whatever. As a married couple, like when we got to walk down the aisle, as if you will, I grew up in a very religious household. I have family members who told me I was better off dead than being gay. And to be able to see those people sit in that celebration, minds changed, right? Over the years, people coming around and not just sitting there like applauding, but sitting there witnessing the other dozens and dozens of people, of friends, of colleagues, of people I went to school with, people, my partner, friends, like old friends, coming together to celebrate us. Like initially when we said we're having a wedding, a lot of our relatives were like, okay, but aren't you two married already? And we were like, but we want to celebrate it, right? And so for my mom, like my mom was not supposed to speak at my wedding, but my mom got up and gave a whole speech in Spanish at my wedding. If you would have told me that 15 years ago, I would have argued and said, you need to drink some water and sober up. Like the celebration, I cannot undermine that. Just the sense, and also accountability, the sense that when we have issues as a couple, as any couple, we come back to that moment and we go, we made vows in front of people. Like that matters. And we answer to those people and to ourselves. But we do go there as a measure of, let's work through this because this was a public thing that we did. There's that. The other piece, and I started looking around at like, what are some of the benefits in the middle of COVID-19? Like when gay or lesbian or same-sex couples, if there was a pandemic like this one where people like marriages were not like something people could do, right? And I think in this country there are somewhere around like 543,000 married same-sex couples. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of families when you also count all the others who showed up to celebrate, right? That's like millions of people, right? Who will be impacted by something like this. What if a partner is in a critical moment or condition? Like, what does that mean moving forward if there's no legal support? Like when you're talking about social security benefits, when you're talking about healthcare, the legal ability to answer for someone, I don't trust anyone else in my life to make choices for me other than my husband. And if he wasn't my husband, then he couldn't. And I'll just relate, this is a really emotional response to your question, which is really centered in policy and law. I just want to point out before I talk about my connection to this and my family particularly, 2/3 of the Supreme Court are Catholics. They identify as Catholic. And I just want to put that out there, which gives me hope. And I just want to put this in here because we know that the Pope very recently made an announcement about civil unions. But when we talk about systems, I think it's 20% of America that identifies as Catholic. So these people who are sitting in these life, appointments, what does that mean for us? Like those of us who are like, that's not, Anyway, just wanted to put that out there, which is really scary too. It's not just conservative, but also identifying as this thing, right? Which speaks not just to those of us who are LGBTQ+, but also what about Muslim folks? What about atheists? What about agnostics? Like, that decision making really just how centralized it is really, really scares me. But I wanted to talk about my dad for a moment. My father passed away in 2000, and I was here. I was already in the U.S. We have been, not speaking for many years, and there was a lot of just things that happened. When he passed away, one of the things I found out was my father he had a heart condition, and so he passed away suddenly. On his funeral, at his wake, a man showed up with whom he had been living and sharing his life for over 16 years. And the family responded by evicting this man from the funeral. And that is one of the things I come back to about the privilege of being able to be married and holding on to it. Because as someone who's a son of a person who literally didn't get to marry the love of his life, and the love of his life didn't get to mourn his death as a community, like that is heartbreaking. And absolutely no one should have to go through that. So it's not about the bells and the whistles. I come back to community and unity and the representation. And I really do believe that there is a direct connection between teenagers and those young ones growing up and being able to see, like, my little niece who walked down the aisle as a flower girl, like that's a story she'll see photos of. And that changes fundamentally how people see us, right? So to take that away, it will be a disaster, and it is the subject matter of my nightmares in this moment.
Yeah. Alberto, I really appreciate your ability to take sort of abstract ideas and give them a face and give them a heart and give them a story and make them human, because of course they are. Even all of these policy decisions and Supreme Court rulings and everything, they're impacting real lives, real families. And Naz, kind of going to you, I think that's the case with the Supreme Court overall, right? Like it's all about real issues, real lives. We are now in a situation where Judge Amy Coney Barrett appears to likely be confirmed and take the seat of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that's a pretty big shift in the court. It's a shift from one justice to another. And, losing Justice Ginsburg is a huge loss in its own right. And so I wonder if you could sort of speak to those two things in the same way Alberta was, with sort of the human lens of the impact on real lives. And so I'd like you to talk about what you think Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy is, why that's important, and what it means to kind of lose that voice on the court. And then also, what do you think this means for the court to experience such a drastic shift with the sixth conservative justice?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the Supreme Court's important, right, for several of the reasons you guys are talking about. RBG, God bless her. She, contributed a lot of great things, right? She was clearly a leader for women's rights, very passionate about, kind of speaking up for what she believed was right. Now, she wasn't without flaws, right? She passed, she wrote the majority decision for, some pretty detrimental federal Indian law cases, so like Cheryl v. Oneida, and, I'm going to do a podcast about that, so maybe you can link it so people can listen to that when I get that done. But, I think Amy Coney Barrett, I think the major problem that I have with her is that she's only been on the federal bench, for 3 years, which to me is just like not enough. We don't know anything about what she's capable of, right? Writing a law review article and being in academia is one thing. There's, a lot of different ways we could, analyze her. Now, one of the things that I think is most important is that she, clerked under Justice Scalia, identifies as a textualist as Justice Scalia was. So, Justice Scalia was an insane person. I'm just gonna, so I'm gonna contextualize this for you. So I went to a Q&A at the Supreme Court back in 2006, I think. I asked Justice Scalia about a case that had just come down, which was also detrimental to federal Indian law, Carcieri. And I said, this has caused a lot of upset attorneys. I'm working on the Hill. It's a very simple, straightforward question. And he yelled at me, screamed in front of this whole room of 60 students, "Did you read the statute?" And I'm like so shook, you guys. Like literally, like I cannot believe that I'm being yelled at by a Supreme Court justice, like to my face. And he kept yelling at me and said, "And if you had read the statute, you would know that now meant 1934." And just just laid me out. And so another Native student asked a question, and he responded, "Hey, all federal Indian law is based off of you guys being conquered, the law of you being conquered. So, basically like get over it." So, and this goes to my point, right? The textualist part, right? Did you read the statute? The word now was written in 1934, therefore it means 1934. Amy Coney Barrett's a textualist. The Supreme Court is important, but Congress makes the laws, right? We need to get people elected into the Congress so that we can change the law. The Supreme Court's not making the law, it's interpreting the law, right? So we've got work to do. That's where I'm gonna leave that.
Would anyone else like to speak to the Supreme Court? Speak about it, not to it. You can go speak to them if you like, but. Okay.
I don't have a lot to say because I'm not an expert. What I want to say to Naz, like, I feel like it says something about you as a human and as like a woman, the high level of man that you got to scream at you. I aspire to have a man as powerful as Justice Scalia scream at me one day. Naz. So I want to put that out there. I listened to a little bit of the confirmation hearings on NPR, and I was getting really mad because what I heard was a job interview for a person who they didn't care if that person could do the job. I've never heard an interview like that. I've never heard someone be able to go and smile their way out of answering a question they should know the answer to. I've never heard someone ask a stream of silly questions. Do you like dogs? Do you hate trees? Do you want to drink clean water? And that be a legitimate part of a process, because it's not a legitimate part of a process because they don't have any concerns about being legit anymore. Like, I read a really great article this morning. Oh no, what was it called? Basically, it was about kind of useless jobs, like people who are in a job where they just show up and they take their paycheck and they know their job doesn't really matter, and so they don't have any concerns deeply about doing it well. And they were saying basically that's what Republicans are doing right now, like our elected Republican officials. And I was like, that is true. And that explains why it's just constant incompetence. It's not incompetence. They just don't care about their jobs. Like, they don't take it seriously. Oh, the article was called "The Ultimate Bullshit Job," and it's in the New Yorker. And I was like, yeah, that's correct. That is correct. And it's about the Supreme Court hearings. And it really encompassed why I was starting to get filled with rage. I was like, if I had job interviews like this where I would know that I was already hired, but I've never been interviewed in a way like this because normal humans don't get jobs, especially not lifetime appointments this way.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that you called that out, because when I was sent into a rage was when Ted Kennedy, what is his name? Senator Kennedy, asked her who does the laundry in her home. And I think I might have thrown the remote through the TV at that moment. Like, first of all, extremely misogynist. Like, who has anybody else on the Supreme Court ever been asked who does the laundry in their home? And second of all, this is a Supreme Court nomination. This is not like, a Vanity Fair interview or a Cosmo quiz. This is a Supreme Court nomination. We're asking people serious questions about how they're going to apply the law. But I really wanted to bring us back to Naz's point. Thank you, John Kennedy. Ted Kennedy is not alive, so apologies for that. Cut that part out, please. Thank you.
It's edited.
Thank you. But I really wanted us to bring us back to what Naz said, which was the way in which the court is currently functioning is not the way it's supposed to function. We are not supposed to have to rely on the Supreme Court to craft and create law or to finagle the law to give us the rights that we are owed. That is supposed to be the job of these feckless, spineless lawmakers who are sitting in Washington, D.C. doing absolutely nothing and collecting their $175,000 a year off the taxpayers' back. That is their job. Their job is to legislate so that we are not left behind by the process. And that's also why it's really important. The work that I do is on a state level. So we do most of our advocacy in Tallahassee. We talk about non-discrimination law. We also do work on the county level and the city level. And the reason for that is really an important one. And that is when Congress fails you, when Washington, D.C. is so broken that they can't get anything done, then it falls on your state to protect you. And the laws that states and counties and cities make are extremely important. You may not know just how much impact your mayor and your city and county commissioners have on the way you live your life every day, but I'll tell you right now, it's far more of an impact than the person who's sitting in Washington, D.C., not doing anything, not making laws. So that's why in this election, and I hope we learn for elections moving forward, it is incredibly important that you understand what's happening, not just on a presidential level, but all the way down the ballot. Every single person that's up for election impacts the way you live your life, all the way down to the water and soil conservation officer. All of the amendments, all of the county charter pieces, all of those impact how you live your life, and they shape the way in which the law impacts you. So if you're frustrated that trans rights is up to Neil Gorsuch's cup of coffee in the morning, if you're frustrated that the Supreme Court is now tilting toward a conservative supermajority, if you're frustrated that Congress can't seem to get anything done except for performative measures on CNN, then know that it is your state and local officials that you're voting for right now that are going to impact your life in a really, really crucial way.
Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. I'm getting another pop-up. Looks like Zoom gave me free extra time, so we didn't get cut off. I don't know why. They said congratulations. I think this is really great. I do want to keep us moving because I appreciate you all giving this time, and I know it's gone longer than I told you it would. I'm sorry. We'll get through it. I'm enjoying it so much. This is a really super great conversation. Sarajan.
Oh, wait, Nate. Before you go any further, the one thing that I really irritated me about Amy Coney Barrett, she could not name one piece of like a law review article, one book about race and the law, the importance of race and the law. So
I remember in college, I had a class where we had to write a paper on the confirmation hearings for Chief Justice Roberts. And I was fascinated by that process. It was the first time I watched a confirmation hearing. And ever since then, I've watched them all. And so I watched almost all of this one with Judge Barrett because we work from home. So I just had it in the background the whole time. And compared to everyone that I've seen so far, this one most seemed like a sham. And so it was really just an unreal process to just, like, the questions weren't even the issue. It was the fact that it was happening at all, that this process was being rushed, that this was the priority thing that should be rushed before the election, and not getting people money and stimulus checks.
Yeah,
for,
no COVID
like,
relief.
response for COVID. Like, that's not the priority, packing the Supreme Court is. And so that was super frustrating for me. I think another thing that's really on my mind for this election, and Sarajan and Alberto, I'd like you to speak to this, is the three of us all work in violence prevention work, and we used to work for the same nonprofit organization that did a lot in particular for power-based violence, like sexual assault and domestic violence. And that's work that I continue now at a university level. And, you know, part of what's been horrible about the Trump administration, in my perspective, is not just what he has done, but it's what a lot of his appointees have done and his cabinet members have done. And so Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos has not only rescinded the Obama era guidance for transgender students, but has also issued new regulations about how colleges and universities can adjudicate sexual misconduct cases. These are the new federal Title IX regulations. We knew they were coming for a while. It was a long process. I think many of us hoped that it wouldn't happen or that the election would come first, but they're in place now. They went into effect this year, back in August. And so the new regulations for Title IX really significantly narrow a school's ability to provide supportive measures and trauma-informed practices. It also escalates the cases to a criminal justice-like system. And so now what used to be trauma-informed and private and very supportive of a process is meant to reflect the criminal justice system. And so there are live hearings with all parties present. People can be cross-examined by lawyers. There may be different standards of evidence rather than a preponderance of evidence that has to be clear and convincing, like a criminal justice system. There's some flexibility in how universities can supplement this policy at the local level, but from the federal lens, there's a whole bunch that's happening. And so I'd like to start with Alberto and have you think about the Title IX stuff particular, and with this shift that comes from Betsy DeVos under the Trump administration, what kind of impact do you think this may have on survivors and on the handling of sexual and relationship violence incidents on college campuses?
I mean, having DeVos in that role has been already really impactful alone, right? Whenever you have someone who doesn't fundamentally understand their role in any position, that's always problematic, particularly when it comes to education. So I do want to say that. The second piece is, I think this is merely anecdotal. I do think that a lot of universities, because of the types of professionals that fall within these positions that adjudicate, that that respond, that do prevention, who care about students, who care about humans, a lot of universities are actively making choices to keep some of the best practices in place, even though it may not be mandated, even though there's no like, oh, here's your requirement, you must meet it. A lot of schools and institutions are making those choices. However, there's a caveat here, right? Like, we know that's a fragile system, because as soon as that person's gone or someone else moves into that position or above, if they're not, like, they don't super care about their job, like you said, then it's possible that's going out the window. Now, I do want to say, I think Title IX in the past few years, serving as part of the committee in like at an institution, and then doing prevention work with a nonprofit that intersects a lot with those different roles. We all know that that hasn't always been super perfect, right? Like, there was a lot of work to be done to tweak and bring it to where it needed to be. I do think that some of the changes and some of the reversals of laws that have happened work against that, against the supporting of survivors, the supporting of students who are reporting, and the training that's required for universities and colleges to be able to train their staff to be able to understand what they're doing in those positions. So my glimmer of hope is there are people who really care about this, and not just people in professional capacities, but students. Like, we are at a moment where I believe students really do take ownership around a lot of these issues, and they're like, wait, what are y'all doing? How are you handling this? And they do bring light into it, and they do use social media to showcase it. And so I'm not happy about what happened, but I do have a lot of hope that we'll be able to move forward, and hopefully, if there's a great outcome to this election, or I don't know, that we can come back to the work. So
yeah, and obviously, if Biden wins the election, I think there are a lot of people who have reasonable hopes that those regulations would change. I think we can expect that. But Saraja, Vice President Biden has his own kind of complicated history with this issue, I think. in many ways, he's considered sort of a hero of VAWA and the violence against women movement. And he's done a lot of work around that throughout his career. And at the same time, we know that there have been multiple people who have made accusations against him as being someone who has perpetuated harm. And so I wonder how you make sense of Biden's sort of complicated history on these issues, and what do you think is important for voters to be considering as it relates to the election?
Sure. I think that, I don't know, I make sense of, I think is hard. I don't try to reconcile or absolve Joe Biden of those accusations. I think that as we're, I think that the way that our society sets up, we think that everybody has to decide whether or not they believe the person who's been impacted before they can act, or before they can go forward. And I don't think that that's kind of reasonable. Like, I think that as we start to think more about, like, what does community accountability look like? How do we hold a person who's been accused of harm accountable? I think that that would change a lot of the narrative around how we talk about Joe Biden, like a person that you like can harm people. People that we know and like in our real lives have harmed people. And the way that we've kind of thought about it traditionally is kind of either I believe them and I don't do anything about this, and I maybe actively harm the person who accused them, or I don't believe them and I cut them off and out of my life. I don't think that we as a society have come up with really great ways to confront sexual violence in ways that are healing or restorative for the person who's been impacted, for the community, for the person who is doing that kind of violence within the community. I think that the work that Joe Biden has done, especially around Title IX and making colleges be accountable for survivors and towards survivors of sexual violence on campuses, has been like tremendous, in his advocacy. I think was really, really impactful. I also think that it's not the end all be all. Like, if we just returned even to like pre-DVOS changes and return to restoring VAWA like as it is, I think that it needs a lot of work, because it's really built on the idea that incarceration heals. And we know that communities of color are reluctant to engage reasonably with these systems. We know that VAWA funnels a lot of money to police. We know that it funnels money to prison systems, and that ultimately this isn't a sustainable way of dealing with sexual violence in our communities. So I hope that, and I wish, and I had wished for better than Joe Biden, honestly. I think that the fact that we keep kind of coming to this place where we have these choices that aren't great choices really speaks to our willingness to continue to not harm ourselves, but not do better or imagine better or dream better for ourselves, because we're so used to kind of how things always are. Like, Joe Biden, things won't get worse. Like, that's not a great that's not a great campaign. But I feel like that's the campaign that Democrats are constantly running. It is not ideal to have a person who is accused of sexual violence against a person who is accused of sexual violence against multiple people, multiple matters of time, and then just be like, well, I mean, at least it's just like 1 or 2 versus like 20 or 30 people who this person has assaulted. That's not a great choice, and it's not a choice that we had to make. Like, but here we are again. Was the question about VAWA? I think VAWA needs to be reformed. I think that it's heavily focused on incarceration and carceral feminism at its roots. I dream of better for dealing with sexual violence in our communities, but it's like a basic bare minimum. And so, again, voting for Joe Biden because I do think that he'd be open to making things better. Like he clearly has invested work in that. And then also, I think having conversations about community accountability and then holding him accountable for harm that he has caused.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And I think, you know, Biden wasn't my primary pick. I tend to be way more progressive in my own kind of personal views. And, you know, the Democratic Party now is making a bet that Biden is a crossover candidate, that he will be able to bring in more people from the more moderate and conservative places who maybe don't see Trump as someone they want to support. Maybe they're more likely to support him. Of course, you know, at the expense of folks on the liberal wing who feel like, you know, it really is a decision of Joe Biden won't make things worse. You know, that's not super exciting and mobilizing. But perhaps that is who we need in this moment to kind of unify around the destruction that's happening from the office of the president right now. But I totally get why some people are kind of disillusioned by that or perhaps less motivated. And so with that in mind, Brandon and Alberto, the three of us are all gay little Florida boys. And I think that we know that Florida is, I think we all love it. I love the state. I think you do too. And I think we all know how wacky it can be at times too, and how unpredictable, and particularly when it comes to politics. And so I'm wondering if both of you could sort of speak to this about, we know there's a lot of conservative folks in Florida, generally in the more northern part of the state. I mean, the saying in Florida is the more, what is it? The more north you go, the more south you get, because the North Florida is more like the southern part of the state. And we know that there are, you know, Alberto, to your point, a large Cuban population in Miami and South Florida that are tend to vote Republican as well. And then we know liberal hubs exist around the larger cities. And so I wonder, sort of from each of your perspectives, what are you hearing on the ground? And what do you think the election is going to look like for Florida this year?
Thank you. That's a great question. I just wanted to come back to the Biden conversation real quick because I can't let that go. I leaned towards Biden from the very beginning for a couple of reasons. Not because I thought he was exciting per se, but I did think that it was important for someone to be at the front that Trump would have a hard time attacking. We know that Trump has a history of attacking women, of attacking people of color, of demonizing them. And I thought that, and we've seen it in the debates, that Biden is like, it's not the person in front of him. It's like, it's either Bernie or AOC or whoever. And with that in mind, I always was like, this is our safest. So for better or for worse, I did consider him a Trojan horse, even though that's the word that's been used on the other side. Because this is a misogynist society. And this is, you know, and so I, you know, in many ways, I was like, this is the safest bet in this moment, but I didn't think it was the most exciting. So I do want to say that. Florida. So Florida is changing. I started doing a little bit of research as I was getting ready for this. And it turns out that a lot of the Generation Z folks, like when you talk about the Hispanic vote, right, in Florida, which is not, we know it's not a monolith, all of that. Like, I'm not about to speak for nobody. I'm just talking about what I found. And it turns out that a lot of those generational, like, new folks, like, who are registering to vote, number one, are registering, this is from the James Madison Institute, they're registering as NPA, which is non-party affiliated, which I'm interpreting this here as like maybe they don't trust either system. It's like, I'm not going to be you or you. And also on the Florida ballot, there is an amendment to basically take away this notion, I don't know what to call it, probably Brandon has a better language than I do, but you don't have to be in one of the parties to be able to vote in the primaries. And that showed up as an amendment. So like those things are going on, right? I also want to say there's a lot more diversity in age. So yes, Florida has a lot of conservative folks. Yes, Florida does have a large older population, but that has changed a lot. we also know that a lot of folks from Puerto Rico migrated to Florida after Hurricane Maria, right? And they've been registering in mostly in Central Florida and other areas. I don't know what that means, but particularly in my community, Cuban American community, a lot of Generation Z folks are literally fighting their parents and their grandparents and saying, come on already with the boogeyman that's communism, that's socialism, because that's really what's there. But the way I talk about it, it's like why it matters to them, right? Why this matters to them that they vote for Trump, what's influencing those decisions, right? And then why is this complete bullshit? And the first one is why does it matter to them? And it's a tradition, like because our ancestors came to this country running away from socialism, the notion of voting Democrat feels like a betrayal to our parents, to our grandparents. It feels like all of the work they did, all of the things they left behind, because of the way that post-Reagan and through Clinton, right, there's been this kind of talk about they're communists. They want to take away, they want you to pay higher taxes so that other people can have things. That's the way it's been funneled. And so fundamentally, like people are going, yeah, we're not going back to that thing. So that's kind of the way. It's like there's a family, scarcity at work. Absolutely. Don't take away my money. And I'm like, dude, did you read Joe Biden's tax plan? It's $400,000 and up. How much do you make? Like, I know how much you make. Stop it, right? So anyway, I don't like, there's misinformation. My dad, for example, listens to this like Spanish speaking radio where they have called Black Lives Matter brujeria. Brujeria is witchcraft. Literally, like that is the label they have put on this movement from like all kinds of misinformation. My dad listens to it because he doesn't have anything else to do. Sometimes but he's like, I don't think that's true. And I'm like, it isn't true. And thank you for bringing it up. Let's talk about this. But that's fundamentally what folks are listening to. Like just these echo chambers that are yelling back whatever they believe. And then the last thing I want to say about this particular community, when I think about how Trump won more than half of the Cuban vote in 2016, I think there was a lot of associations with Hillary. I think in the Cuban community, Hillary has a long history of, all the things, including the Elian situation. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. There's a very famous photo, with Elian, and that goes back through a long, again, the generational trauma and the betrayals of my parents and how do I vote to make sure I still hold on to to this family tradition of being Republicans. I have friends who lie to my face. They've told me, I didn't vote in the last election, Cuban friends. And I go, okay. And then I look up their voting record and it says they voted. And I'm like, who's lying? Who's lying? And so there is a shame around also voting for Trump because of what this means. And if you're listening and you think it's you, it probably is, okay? I'm talking about you on this podcast. It is painful. It is painful, and it's causing a lot of divide. I also have had people reach out to me who voted for Trump in 2016 in my, friends of the family who are Cuban who said, I want to call you to apologize for having voted for this person who has fundamentally destroyed our country. And I now see it, and I want you to know that, please find it in yourself to forgive me, but I am voting for Biden, and I just wanted to let you know that. And I'm like, thank you. And also, what the fuck? And so there's just a lot of stake in Florida. Every day I wake up and I Google Florida, like what's happening? Because Florida, we know, has been like flip, flop, flip, flop, flip, flop over the years and past decades. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I think, part of what you just said is some of the fear that I still have. It's why I'm not trusting the polls, all the polls that are so strongly in Biden's favor. I just don't trust it because we saw that in 2016. And there were a lot of people who were secretly voting for Trump, who did have the kind of, I'm not going to talk about it because it's not popular or whatever, but I'm still going to vote for him. And so that's the fear that I have going into this. And it's why I think, it's so important, of course, that everyone votes, but especially it's important that people don't think Joe Biden has this in the bag because the polls say he does. We don't know what turnout's going to be. We don't know what's going to happen with all the mail-in ballots. We don't know what legal challenges will come. The best way to avoid all of that is if Joe Biden wins in a landslide, right? So that it's not close. It doesn't have to go to the courts. It doesn't have to do that sort of thing. And so part of what you mentioned is definitely what I have in mind. Brandon, what about you? What's going on in Florida from your perspective?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think sometimes in 2020, and maybe this is just me feeling a little salty, but Florida has been left out of the conversation because people have already written it off that we're just going to be a disappointment. So they're going to pour their resources into, Wisconsin and Michigan and Texas and Georgia, which is also super embarrassing because, people are relying on Georgia and saying Florida's a lost cause. I think we have a lot of ground to make up. The amendment you were talking about, Alberto, is a jungle primary amendment, which would change the primary system to be just anybody can vote for anybody, and whoever get the top 2 vote getters are the people who move on to the general. My flag there, I voted no on that amendment, just so everybody knows. My flag there is that in a state like Florida, in 2018, that would never have meant Andrew Gillum would have been on the ticket. We would have had 2 Republicans running for governor in the general election. So I just caution there that I think a jungle primary does a lot to marginalized populations kind of in a double way. So the question is, what's happening on the ground in the state of Florida? I like Alberto's sort of positive thinking about the way Florida is changing. I want to inject just a little bit of the fear that you're talking about, Nate, back into that conversation, and say that I think that Florida is, first of all, if you see polls that say Joe Biden is leading by 3 or 4 points in Florida, they're lying to you. That is not what I feel on the ground. It's not what I see in the communities. I think Florida will likely be, as it always is, in a 1 to 2 point margin in either direction. That's exactly where it was in 2016. For those listening, if you weren't watching Florida returns closely, Donald Trump won this state by 113,000 votes out of like 9.5 million cast. So it's just really razor thin. And then the other thing I think that makes Florida really complex is that it is changing pretty rapidly, but I don't think it's changing entirely in the ways that people think it is. I think that because we are a low tax state with beautiful weather and gorgeous beaches, we get a ton of influx of people who retire, almost seemingly at the same rate that we get people moving into urban centers. So, I'm thinking about places like Sarasota County, which is on the southwest side of Florida. We think about the red parts being the Panhandle, and it's like Panhandle versus everyone else. But the reality is there are huge swaths of red throughout Central and South Florida as well, including Sarasota County, which is a huge retirement community, all the way out to Palm Beach County. You may remember my friends from Palm Beach County who went to their city commission meeting to protest masks and talked about citizens arresting the city commissioners. So all of that is happening throughout the state of Florida. And I think that's why it makes Florida really a microcosm of what's happening across the country. In many ways, Florida is like a mini United States in one state. So the real question is, what's going to happen? And this is the work that we've been doing. So again, for your listeners, Equality Florida on June 12th, to mark 4 years after the Pulse shooting, launched the largest state equality elections program in the country's history. We are working to mobilize about 500,000 pro-equality voters that are low propensity, which means we're not really sure they're going to show up unless somebody calls them and helps them make a plan to vote. And those are voters for whom issues of LGBTQ equality are also the thing that might actually get them out of their chairs and to the polls. So that's been our focus over the last several months. And what I'm seeing gives me hope. It gives me pause. I do have 2016 PTSD as well. The returns are really positive. Democrats are running away with vote by mail returns. For those who are listening, if you were thinking about 2016, how does that compare to now? Exponentially more people have voted in Florida than had voted at this point in 2016. On top of that, Republicans held a lead at this point in 2016, and Democrats currently lead by like 300,000 votes over Republicans. So there's a lot of energy there. On top of that, there's a lot of those folks who didn't vote in 2016. We know several 100,000 of the 5-point-some odd million people that have already voted are the ones who didn't show up in 2016 for one reason or another. So that's another really positive sign. The things that should give us pause And I say that because I want people to donate to Races in Florida, Fund Equality Florida, whatever you have to do, volunteer your time. The things that should give us pause are this. Democrats have built a huge vote by mail lead. Republicans are voting early in far larger numbers than Democrats. So the lead we built was at 500 and some thousand before early voting started. Republicans have already knocked 200,000 off of that because they're showing up in droves to the polls. They want to vote in person. There's a very real fear on the ground in Florida that Democrats have cannibalized election day voting, that people who would have voted on November 3rd have simply cast their ballot by mail. And so we may see that lead erode. And then we would, if we go in head to head on election day, we would probably lose election day voting. So I say that to throw a flag that while we have a lead, there's still room for Republicans to make up that ground. It's really important that we continue to ask people to show up early, to return those vote by mail ballots. There's a ton of those outstanding. And honestly, it comes down to a handful of communities. In the chat, Saraja asked about formerly incarcerated. Some formerly incarcerated folks are voting. If y'all don't follow the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, their co-founder and executive director voted today, which is really exciting. I saw a video of him. It was really cool to watch. And some folks are voting. That said, Governor DeSantis continues to make it as challenging as possible. He's tried to block people from paying their fines and fees. The state tried to sue Mike Bloomberg for paying off people's fines and fees. They're doing everything they can to make that really difficult. Mm-hmm. Latin communities, obviously, same thing. They're going to be hugely important to the outcome. And the LGBTQ community. I told you there's 500,000 LGBTQ and allied voters who are out there. We need them to turn out. So if you're going to spend an hour phone banking anywhere, please make it Florida.
Right. And the context for the formerly incarcerated situation is that the voters of the state of Florida voted to give those folks their voting rights back. And it was the Republican-led state legislature that then kind of impeded that by requiring the paying of all past due fines and that sort of stuff. And so that's sort of where that's at right now. And I agree with you, Brandon. I do think that in many ways, Florida is sort of a microcosm of the country in a lot of ways. And so that's why I like hearing. But the other sort of takeaway, I think, from this part of the conversation is that it's not just about the top of the ticket, right? It is about voting up and down the ballot. It's about the state and local elections. And particularly for all the swing states where we have the potential to take back the Senate. I live in DC where we are not a state and I do not have a senator. And if you follow me on social media, I'm very vocal about that. I'm very pro DC statehood. And I hate that for the first time in my life, I don't have a senator to call when I want to express my concerns about Betsy DeVos's appointment and whether or not they should confirm them and the Supreme Court and all the other things that senators do. But it just kind of highlights the importance of these state and local level elections. Saraja and Naz, actually, you're the first one who alerted me to this on social media, is recently the president has been really vocal about being against racial sensitivity trainings and calling them racist, saying that it's racist and un-American to talk about critical race theory, to talk about implicit bias and those sorts of things. And I know, Naz, you brought this to my attention. I'd like you to talk to it first. And Suraj, I know this connects very intimately with the work that you do through your consulting organization. And so, Naz, tell us first a little bit about what you would say to that argument Trump's trying to make about this being inherently un-American, because that does resonate with some folks. And I know people in my life who say, like, they're destroying our history, they're tearing down the statues, and it is racist. They're trying to make us be a racist nation, and we want to be patriotic. And so what would you say about that and the importance to actually having these sorts of trainings?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that, the U.S. has never held its word, the founding fathers, term I obviously detest, has never been, this has not been, right, the land of the free. This has never been a true democracy, right? And so we are still struggling to enforce and uphold those original words, right? And in some instances, those original words were completely fucked up, right? So you want to talk about like the 3/5 compromise, that where essentially slaves were counted as 3/5 of the amount of whatever white property. Let me look at the language real quick. Blacks enslaved blacks in a state would be counted as 3/5 of the number of white inhabitants of that state, right? So there's that. That's enshrined. That was, and that's what required the 13th Amendment. And then we've got, the Declaration of Independence calling, indigenous people merciless merciless savages, right? And so, like, we've got to actually have a reckoning, right? We have to have this racial reckoning. We need this moment of reckoning to actually achieve the freedom that we all thought that we were entitled to in the great United States of America. So, the fact that people are trying to do this kind of, reversed revisionist history, where saying that, oh, critical race theory, which is, just inherently acknowledging the truth of this country, talking about the fact that laws, enabled inequitable systems, were founded in inequitable systems, and the law enshrined those and supported those inequity. Or that inequity. And so we needed to, we do need to move forward and move past that. And so by the federal government trying to say that, critical race theory is un-American propaganda is, it's really the first, right, like indication that this is not, a free country, right? They're really teetering on the brink of fascism. And so, you could argue that we've passed that point, right, in some ways. And so this is an indicator, and I implore everybody to just like read, read, get aware of, what is actually happening. And I don't think that we will, let this kind of behavior stand. I certainly will do the best, to the best of my ability to, make sure these things get overturned as soon as possible.
Yeah. So Raja?
Yeah, I think that, so the way that it works is that, like, as you're signing up for a contract, and I haven't had to go through this process yet, thankfully, as you're signing up for a contract, you're basically agreeing that you won't incorporate these things into your contract, into your speech, into your education materials. And if you do intend to, then it has to go through a review board, and the review board then gets to determine whether or not your curriculum or your presentation or whatever passes, if it's going to cover those verboten topics. The consequences is that if you do forbid those topics, then you can be hammered. Like, you can get banned from receiving federal contracts. And there's a tip line for people to snitch on you if you're a federal contractor who—
You're joking.
I am not joking.
Wow.
It is a literal. So when you mention like fascism, those are a lot of the things that we're starting to experience that feel really unsettling are just indicators of fascism, like self-censorship, classic fascism. Like, because the consequences are so great if you speak about something truthfully, then you start to censor yourself. They're asking contractors to self-censor. So now you have to decide, if you're a contractor, am I going to fully present about this topic or answer truthfully about this topic, or am I going to try to censor myself so that a disgruntled employee doesn't snitch on me to the tip line and then potentially impact my livelihood? I think if you're thinking about self-censorship in particular, I think a good place to look and be like, how does this connect to fascism? Is fascism in Italy? I think there's like a lot of literature about censorship and that self-censorship. I think the tip line was the thing that put me over the top. So I think then deciding if I'm saying that I'm doing like racial justice work or anti-racist work, how do I do that and then like preserve myself? And is there a way? I've definitely told folks who I intended to have like contracts with or discussions with that I won't be able to return until January, until Trump's out of here, man. Like I don't think that I have like one presentation, it's kind of a gateway presentation to get people to think about power, but then like beyond that, I think that you have to have more in-depth discussions with people. But I think the thing that I find most concerning is the encouraging of self-censorship and how that's happening across the media, how that's now happening with these federal contractors, how that's happening within the government agencies, because you've seen people get fired from multiple government positions for being competent or for talking confidently and honestly, transparently about coronavirus. And I think that every step to get people to censor themselves, and every time we make that choice, I think it just bolsters a fascist regime. Like when we start to accept that it's okay for people to tell us not to talk about justice. And I think that the way that the United States teaches history really makes it so that it seems optional to have these conversations. We just started to have them in the past like 10 years. Like this is all like a very new conversation where it's like a national conversation and not just like marginalized people having these conversations. I feel like the hard suppression of the left in the 70s and 80s really tamped those down, but now they're like coming back, but now they're getting tamped down again. The moral of the story is life is hard, and I mean, like, resist. Like, don't, like, we have to decide that each as individuals, how we are going to resist that fear, resist that loathing, resist that sense of individualism and self-preservation that can cause us to not do what is right or just or kind or community oriented.
Yeah, and many of us have been those contractors or been in similar contracting positions. I remember in 2016 when the administration changed, I guess in 2017, January, that was a big difference because we already had contracts, right? I was leading a contract with the DoD, started under the Obama administration. Was very excited. I would geek out every time I got to go to the Pentagon, and you all know that because I would say it to everyone. And then when that shifted under the Trump administration, we did, mostly we were removed from the political aspects with the work that we were doing, but we did see changes in resources. We did see changes at the base level and the support that the violence prevention specialists who are at each base, the resources that they had. And it was really hard to do this work, in particular sexual and relationship violence work, under a new administration who was to many a sexual predator, and we know about all those claims. And so I know what that shift in administration was like going one way, and I'm hoping that this January we'll see the shift in the administration going back the other way and see these sorts of regulations on federal changes be not only taken away, but included more intentionally, that we should be having these conversations, especially people in leadership, especially people within the systems of power, because that's where marginalized folks get lost the most and disproportionately.
Nate, in the thread of fascism, real quick, one moment, one image that really triggered me because of my history and where I come from was the image at the Washington, outside the White House a few months ago when we saw police gassing protesters and coming down on horses. And that scene, the way it was shot, just really triggered me because I know exactly where I've seen that before. And it was in Havana, in Cuba, when there were people try to rise up and the government would literally shoot at its own people and kill them, and then tell a different story to the world. And so look no further, play the tapes, like look up revolution, the Cuban Revolution, look up Italy. I know Saraja brought that up, Stalin, look up the Dominican Republic under Trujillo. they're all there, and they're all visible, and compare notes, and take a look, and then inform yourself as you go into the polls. And the last thing I want to say, because I do have to run in a few minutes, is if you already voted, that's great. Think about 5 people in your life who you can reach out to and check in on them and ask them what they need to make it happen, and make it happen for them. It's not enough to say, I did it, I checked the box, I'm good. No, call people, talk to people, and help others get to the polls on November 3rd.
Yeah. Okay, as we start to wrap up, I have one final question that I'd like to ask everybody. As you know, this is the Second Way podcast. And so part of the premise behind this podcast and this blog, this kind of small little project, labor of love that I have, is in part about seeing past, oops, sorry, I hit my microphone. It's about, it comes from the quote from Albert Einstein about there are 2 ways to see your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. And part of my sort of life motto is to try and seek that second way, to see the miraculous in one another and all around us. And the other kind of way that I use the phrase is to think about a different way of doing things, a second way of doing things. And so with this question, I'm thinking about a second way of doing politics. And I'd love to hear from each of you. If you could dream big, anything goes. If you could change something about our process, our systems, either specific to the election, meaning like voter suppression, voter ID laws, eliminating the Electoral College, but also just sort of broader to our systems of governments in general. So things like defunding the police, abolishing ICE, campaign finance reform, whatever those things may be. If you could change one thing that might help us approach this from a new lens, a second way of doing that thing, what would you pick? And I'd like to hear from everyone. And so who wants to start? Saraja, Brandon, go ahead.
So thank you. First of all, thank you for putting this group together and allowing us to go through such a wide breadth of topics. I am in my work life, because I work alongside the media so frequently, I find myself having to cram my thoughts into 90 seconds at a time, and I get to come in with 2 bullet points prepared, and I get to one of them. So I just appreciate you giving us plenty of time to sort of digest and talk through a lot of things that are on people's mind right now, because what you've captured in 2.5 hours or so is just a sliver of what people are facing today in this country, in this election. All of it is weighing on people's minds as they wait hours and hours to vote. So I just appreciate you giving the space for that. I also, you know me well, so you know that I don't like to be boxed in by parameters of the question, so I'm not going to choose to be boxed in.
Oh no, you froze for me. Did he freeze for others? Okay.
By the way,
Hey,
am I still
Brandon.
frozen?
Okay, yeah, you're back now if you want to go ahead and back up.
Okay. So anyway, I was saying that you know me well, so you know that I don't like to be boxed in by the parameters of a question, and so I'm going to choose not to be boxed in by this one. And instead, I'm going to say that there isn't one policy or structure that I might change, but rather I would change the philosophy by which we govern the country and by which we treat each other. And by I mean, I would shift us away from a system where we value people only on what they produce for us, that we value people beyond just the tangible items that we see them possess or share, that we value people based on who they are, the intellectual capital they bring, the differences they bring to the table, that we would reconstruct our entire system so as not to continue to give piles of resources to people who already have them because we've assigned them a value in society, but rather to rework the system to assign resources and value to everyone, to ensure that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, people don't go hungry, people aren't sleeping on the street, that people have the very basics healthcare that they need to survive. So I guess I wouldn't change just one policy or institution, but rather I would change the philosophy by which we govern and live. And that is to reassign value to everyone instead of a handful of people.
Thanks. Naz, what would you say?
I love what Brandon said, so I'm gonna say, yep, everything that Brandon said. And then, one time I did this program in DC many years ago, probably around the same time I got yelled at by Justice Scalia. And there was a Q&A, and Chuck Todd was doing the Q&A. And so I asked him, I was like, I've been traveling a lot. And so, I wanted to, really kind of re-envision, like, what would it look like if we had, like they have a Maori party in New Zealand. And so they have Maori senators and they run for their, they have their seats in parliament, right? And I was like, what would it look like if we just had more than a two-party system that was a valid more than two-party system, right? And so Chuck Todd thought that it would never happen, but I have hope. So, that's one thing that I would like to see changed. And of course, the Electoral College has to go.
Right. Amen to all of that. Alberto,
if I could change something, and like if I had a magic wand, it would be that with the same intensity and force that this remove all social justice conversations from education, like with that same intensity that climate change was actually embedded as scientific.
I'm about to talk for just a minute, babe.
Okay. Oh, what? Did I cut off?
I'm sorry, I'm not muted.
You're not muted, that's fine.
That means you can hear us like singing and.
Oh, it's all good. I was just saying, I wish we treated climate change with the seriousness that it deserves. And I say this because I talked about the avocados and the mangoes. Okay, I recently have been going down to the
Come
bay.
on, Mother Nature.
Mother Nature. I've been going down to Bal Harbour. Nate, you probably are familiar with Bal Harbour. I don't know, Brandon, if you've been to South Florida, that kind of 123rd North Miami Beach. And as I walk across the bridge every so often with my spouse, ever since COVID hit and there's been a decrease in boating and like people are not out there as much, you actually get to see dolphin families like hanging out there. You get to see more manatees. And I'm not saying that to equate that with climate change, but there are so many like scaffolding pieces of our footprint on this planet. And I just would love for us to take some more ownership and responsibility for making sure that we preserve it and take care of it because it's taking care of us. So anyway.
Oh, I love that. And Alberto, I have to apologize because I heard my Oklahoma accent come through really thick earlier when I said Alberto. So my apologies. Saraja, what do you think? Oh no, I'm frozen. Hold on.
I think the emphasis.
Okay, my internet froze for a second. If you could start over.
Sure.
Okay.
I love the conversations that we've been having around scarcity, and I appreciate Brandon bringing us back around that multiple times. I think the idea that there's enough to go around and we can mechanize the distribution of resources, I think is a really important one. I think that the thing that I guess hope that people do going forward or think going forward is just like dreaming bigger, wanting better for themselves and for their neighbors, and knowing that there's enough for us all to have a really good life, not just even just an acceptable life, but a really good life. And people who feel like they have a good life right now, the constant stress of like making bill payment or getting childcare or just surviving, even people who make $250,000 a year are feeling that stress, and it like doesn't have to be that way. Like those are things that we've chosen. This is a way that we've chosen to exist. And that when we choose to take care of each other, then a lot of the things that make it hard for us to live and to love and to spend more of our time with our families and taking care of our mangoes and avocados, a lot of those things can fall away. I hope that I think that hope also goes into what Naz was saying. I don't think that having a two-party system is reasonable. Like, I don't think that we permanently have to be governed by the ideology or the values of people who lived 400 years ago and were so different from us and made vastly different choices. And I don't think that they meant for us to. Like, I don't think that people imagine that you'll follow rules that they wrote in a completely different society for completely different humans. And so my hope is that I think that we'll dream bigger, and that those dreams will be for each other.
Yeah. I love, respect, and appreciate each of you so much. This went so much longer than I told you it would, and I'm so sorry, but I'm super grateful for the conversation. I'm so glad each of you participated. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts or things that you want to add that maybe we didn't get to that you'd like to share before we go, or anything that you would like to let listeners know in case they want to follow your work in some way?
I'm just going to plug Equality Florida one more time, because I told you it really matters what happens to Florida. I'll leave you with this tiny little bit of information. There are only 2 Democrats in history who have won the presidency without Florida, and I don't want to try for a third. So please, 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 let us end this here in the state of Florida. Check us out. We're doing incredible work. We really can. We can make the difference, and I know that with everyone's help, we can get it over the finish line.
Awesome. Anyone else?
Yeah, man, everybody vote. This has been a wonderful conversation. I am, see, and this is why I'm hopeful, right? Because beautiful minds. So, I'm glad we were able to chat, and Nate for putting this together. Mahalos. Appreciate you. And until next time.
Thank you, Nate. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, Nate. If you are interested in learning more about the work that I'm hoping to do and the dreams that I'm dreaming, you can follow me, Groundsheet, GROUNDSHEET. I have a Patreon if you want to sponsor my work. I put out pretty regular newsletters. I say regular, I've done one, but I intend to do more. They will be regular newsletters. I talk about a lot of stuff, and also I hope people vote. I'm a socialist and I'm voting for Joe Biden. I think about this strategically. I think about measurable results, and he will be measurably better than Trump and easier to fight. If you're thinking about video game style, what boss do you want? You want a boss who kind of wants you to win too.
Yeah. Okay, I'm feeling inspired. Alberto just said the same thing in the chat. So I'm so inspired by each of you. I'm going to spend the rest of today editing this episode so that we can get it actually out before the election. But I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for making this time and for sharing your perspectives and your stories and your expertise. I appreciate you all so much, and I hope you have a great, wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye. It was really nice to meet you, Brandon. I love you, Alberto.
Yeah, this was fabulous.
Make friends, talk with each other. We're all connected now.
Yep.
Thank you all. Appreciate you.
All right. Love you guys.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.